it's just so, I think, comforting and helpful to know that any muscle that might be lost is going to be eager to be regained.
Like right now, I'm not training my legs hardly at all. It's psychologically very painful, but I'm able to train my upper body so much that I've been able to drop my steroid doses down to like literally replacement levels from much, much higher. And I'm still roughly the same size and strength in my upper body, even a little bit bigger. And I know, I'm betting, that when I come back to leg training, like literally months or even longer from now, they're gonna re-sprout like crazy. Folks, it's me, Dr. Mike, for RP Strength. And we are here with Josh of Data Driven Strength, one of the three heroes of the new scientific movement.
A three-headed monster, if you will.
Oh my God. Is there like a particular head that you have to cut off that kills the whole thing? Or is it just kind of like one?
I said 3 heads, not 3 limbs. But there's probably some connection there, I think.
Yeah. One neck, but 3 heads is kind of an awkward look.
Yeah.
It's more of like a disfigured person than like a hydra that is like mythical and elegant.
I'm in the middle though, so that's all I know.
My man. All right. Now that we've established you to be an egoist, we can go on with questions. You ready to talk about science stuff?
Let's do it.
All right. So first question for you is, you guys recently did a meta-regression, a couple of them, as a matter of fact, and they addressed the concepts of volume and frequency. So we'll talk about both if that's okay. We'll see how far we get. Is this in the context of strength or in the context of hypertrophy?
Both.
Get the fuck out. So we have 4 things to talk about.
You mentioned a couple meta-regressions. There were 4 main ones. For the super nerds, we actually did dozens and dozens on the back end, but those were the best ones, if you will. So volume, frequency, strength, and hypertrophy.
I love it.
Yeah.
I have to call this out. I'm a super nerd. For people listening, where can they access the other ones?
So if you pull up the manuscript, there's links throughout the manuscript, which is kind of like you have the paper itself. Then you have like stuff that you kind of just, hey, this isn't really for the paper, but it's important, or it might be helpful for some people.
I love it.
So it's a website called the Open Science Framework. Just allows you to put all your stuff there, all your code, all your data, other things that might be helpful, but it's not the meat and potatoes, if you will.
Sure. That's amazing. Is there any way you could send us that link so that we can throw it in the description for folks?
Very easily.
Scott, is that okay? Scott's like, nah. All right. First of all, okay, so training volume is roughly how many sets you're doing per session and per week. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Training frequency is like, how often are you hitting the same muscle group / movement pattern? That's what you guys were looking at? Not like total frequency of like you go to the gym 4 days a week versus 3.
Exactly. Everything was muscle specific.
Muscle specific.
And a key thing that we did differently compared to previous projects on volume and frequency is we didn't count everything the same. So in other words, previous projects might have said bicep curls, lat pull downs, rows. Those are all the same for biceps. All use the biceps somehow. All use the biceps, so they're all one set for the biceps, or they're all 1 day per week for the biceps if that's in one session. What we did is we took a slightly different approach. We took indirect sets, so something like the effects of lat pull downs on biceps hypertrophy, we counted that as half of a set.
So fractional set counting.
Which
is fucking smart.
Yeah.
Because you ain't getting the same bicep stimulus and pump and soreness from lat pull downs as you are from curls, unless you're God knows what the hell you're doing.
Everyone's always known that something like that is better, but it's hard to do from a research perspective because you have to be objective and tight with your methods. So it's kind of hard to like make some of those decisions and justify it.
Why is it half?
So what we did is like, okay, let's do both. We know it's better, but let's also kind of see if we can't prove it. So we did some fancy statistical stuff to basically show that fractional approach better describes the underlying data compared to just counting everything the same. We actually also looked at just direct sets as well. So just bicep curls for the biceps and just ignore rows and pull downs, that sort of thing. But again, the fractional approach was better. So that's, some decent evidence that, okay, that indirect training is contributing, but not quite as much as direct training.
Right. So two things are not as correct as the third. If you just count only bicep work, you're missing something. If you count everything that's pulling and using the biceps as the same bicep work, you're missing something. If you count the stuff that's direct work as more than the stuff that's indirect, but you count them both, you're getting closer to the truth, which is like makes tons of sense anyway.
Bingo.
Okay, I love it. Let's, Scott, is it okay if we stick to only muscle growth for this conversation and like maybe have the guys back again to talk about strength or some shit, or never, because no one gives a fuck about strength on our channel. And I love strength and sports, and every time I make a video about it, everyone's like, shut up.
I'm going to weave it in here or there, but...
My man.
Yeah.
Excellent. Because everyone low-key cares about it, but we can't title the video strength because otherwise just people just don't watch.
Hey, RP strength.
Fuck, you're right, dude. That does us no favors at all. The alternative is Renaissance periodization, which I can't spell. So we really fucked ourselves. That was actually, I came up with the name of the company. So should have done something differently. I fucked
Can't point the finger.
Well, that's me. I love pointing a finger at somebody else. Okay. So volume and dose response. What did you guys find?
Yeah.
Tell us the story.
Yeah. So in the past, and just a lot of research in general kind of looks at things categorically. So, for example, previous analyses have said, hey, if I do less than 10 sets per week versus more than 10 sets per week, and I put all of this available studies into that analysis.
2 buckets.
2 buckets, exactly. Or maybe 3 buckets, which is better than 2 buckets. But still, there's something missing with that bucket approach, right? Because really what I care about, what I think lifters care about, what I think coaches care about is, okay, sure, 10 sets might be greater than... might produce more hypertrophy than less than 10 sets on average. But what about beyond that point? And also, as I go from 1 set to 10 sets, how does the hypertrophy response change, right?
I go from 3 to 8. They're like, oh, no difference. But hold on. It's like
it's
more than
like,
double the volume. Yeah.
Like previous work has been super helpful to get to this point. But where we came in is we said, something's missing here. We want to understand the dose response relationship. And when I say dose response, it's okay, as more volume is performed, what is the nature of the additional hypertrophy? Is it this linear response where it just kind of goes forever and you get more and more hypertrophy and the 30th set is just as productive as the first set? Or maybe there's kind of the opposite of that, would be like the inverted U hypothesis, right? Okay, you see really strong hypertrophy from additional sets, and then eventually it kind of plateaus off. But then eventually you maybe even do too many sets to the point where you see worse and worse hypertrophy. And actually that inverted U hypothesis is pretty common. And I think it's a fair hypothesis, right? I think it makes sense to assume that there's probably a point of doing too much. However, what our analysis did is we basically tested a bunch of the science term for it is functional forms or dose response models. But basically that just means, what does the line look like?
Yeah.
What is the curve
fitting?
Yeah. What is the curve? What is the best curve to describe the data that we have? And basically what we found is that it is nonlinear, which is key. Okay. So the technical term for this is called a square root model, but basically it looks like a line, but it kind of plateaus off a bit. But importantly, there was no clear plateau point. So there's no point where we could absolutely say with confidence that, hey, beyond this point, additional hypertrophy does not occur.
What was the highest volume sample you used?
So off the top of my head, it was...
Yeah, just super rough.
Yeah, like in the 30s.
In the 30s.
In the 30s, but there's just not much.
Sure.
There's not much. I would say once you get above 25, and again, we're talking about fractional sets, which is important to keep in mind, because if you think of bicep training, you're probably just thinking about the curls you're doing.
Right.
So if maybe you could replace 25 with like 20, just that kind of allows you to think of it as one and the same. Once you get above that point, it's like, man, we just don't have much data.
Sure.
So you kind of see these confidence intervals, which is basically saying, our analysis saying like, yeah, we think the line goes here, but it could conceivably go anywhere within this range.
We're less and less sure the sparser the data gets at the extremely high volumes.
Yep.
Whereas like studies between 10 and 15 sets, but fucking dozens of those.
Right.
So we really know some stuff there. But at 25, 30, 30 plus, we're not so sure. However, the data we have collected is like, there doesn't seem to be a clear like, nope, this is it.
Yep, exactly. So with that said, I think someone could hear that and be like, oh, more is better, which might be true to some degree, but it's really important to understand the concept of diminishing returns. So put simply, diminishing returns, that means that for each additional set that you do, the marginal hypertrophy or the additional hypertrophy you get on top of the hypertrophy you've already gotten is smaller and smaller, right? So each set becomes less and less efficient. The diminishing returns were pretty strong, right? So as a rough heuristic, the sets at the end of our data set, so let's say 25 plus, compared to some of those initial sets, going from like 0 to 5 sets per week, they were about 1/3 as productive. So put another way, your initial sets are way more productive than those later ones. You get less and less return as you go.
So basically, if you can grow 5 pounds of muscle in a year doing 10 sets, if you go from, you're like, fuck this, full send, you go from 10 sets to 20 sets in the next year, and assuming that like the training history somehow doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Or there's a parallel universe.
Parallel universe you go straight to fucking 20, you're expected to grow like 7 pounds of muscle, not like
it's not double.
10.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not double, and it's not even time and a half. So it's not like you're going to grow 7.5. You might grow 6.25, which is more. And over time matters. But like, if you aren't getting amazing gains at 20 sets per week, it is unlikely that at 25 sets, you're going to see some kind of like amazing unlock where you just get mega jacked.
Yeah. Exactly. And I also think it's important to keep in mind that these studies are short term, right? The average duration of the studies in our meta-analysis, so there were 35 total studies, which is a pretty well-powered meta-analysis, but again, with the higher and higher volumes, less and less power as we discussed. But the average duration of those studies was 10 weeks. And the way that I think about it is, okay, we see this dose-response relationship, but we got to keep in mind those diminishing returns. We also got to keep in mind the fact that it is a fundamentally different question to say, hey, you have 10 weeks, go get as jacked as possible, compared to saying, hey, you have even the next year, let alone the next decade or the next 20, 30-year training career, go get as jacked as possible. Totally different questions. And my hope beyond informing practice in the short term is that leads to some interesting questions of like, okay, you see better results in the short term, but am I just kind of approaching my natty max or my natty limit, if you will, which is probably not a true absolute point, but we would have to believe that gains slow down over time. Mm-hmm. Am I just kind of approaching that point of gains slowing down quicker?
Yeah.
Right? Does it actually change the long-term
with higher
ceiling?
Injury risk and with higher burnout risk?
Exactly. And that's why I love opportunities like this to discuss this topic, because even though we see this dose-response relationship, I don't really feel like a high-volume guy, if you will. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, as a scientist, I don't want to be in a camp, because that's just kind of gets a little messy, because you want to be as in the middle ground as possible. But beyond that, I think it's really helpful. But I also think I ask myself some of these hard questions, like, okay, if you took person A and person B and they both train for 10 years, right? And one does 20 sets per week and one does 10 sets per week on average. Do I think that the one doing 20 sets per week is going to reach a higher peak, right? I don't know the answer to that question. So my mental model is that the differences of higher versus lower volume are going to kind of get smaller and smaller with longer and longer durations. Yeah. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. In large part because, at least far I understand it, training seems to be somewhat about unlocking your genetic potential more than just brute forcing shit. And so if you had the satellite cell pool and all that other stuff to get jacked, you can get jacked more slowly by doing lower volumes, get there later. You can get jacked more quickly by doing higher volumes, get there sooner. But at some point, the gains will really, really start to slow down for you one way or another. And if you go on low volumes, obviously the high volumes, like, you're going to get there faster. And that's cool. I'm not trying to downplay that.
Yeah.
At your current bodybuilding show you're training for, what matters is how jacked you are now. People are like, oh man, he's got a lot of potential, 4th place. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, if you're looking at it from a career perspective, let me know if this is off base or if you think it's maybe got some value to it. If you're getting excellent gains, though not your best you could, from very low numbers of sets early, you're still loving training. There's no chance of burnout. As a matter of fact, you train so little that you're super excited about training all the time because like, I want more, but you're holding back. Your joints and connective tissues don't take a needless beating. You save lots of time for other activities. And as you fall more in love with the process and as you want more gains, you can uncork more volume from your little volume jack-in-the-box thing that opens up. And so save that shit for when you need it so that your gains can look more linear over time rather than you go, and then the rest is like, this sucks, I'm eking out bullshit. Is there something to that?
I think so. I think categorically, I would tend to agree with that thinking. I think there is an interesting discussion to be had about whether those changes in volume themselves are inherently beneficial beyond just the actual volume you're doing. But maybe we can put a pin in that for the resensitization discussion.
Sure.
Because that gets really interesting. But I very much agree with the spirit of that thinking, because the way that I think about it is, we see this dose response relationship, but like we kind of want to maximize the quality of training over a really long time period. So if you're training with these super high volume programs and you're kind of borderline recovering, borderline hurt all the time, your quality work under the curve for years might be less than if you just did a lower volume program where you can dominate the workload and you can train really productively, recover really well, and not resent training. And
you ain't training anymore after you start that shit. Nobody's putting a gun to your head.
Right. So the way that I think about our analysis, which I think gives us kind of the best look at the underlying data of the dose response relationship over about 10-week periods, that's super helpful, but I don't really view it as prescriptive. I view it as conceptual, and I view it, you can kind of look at it from two angles at the same time. We actually were able to statistically determine a minimum effective dose from the average participants in these studies, and that number was 4 weekly fractional sets for a muscle. So that could look like,
or 2 regular sets.
So it could look like 2 direct sets plus 4 indirect sets. So 2 sets of curls on one day, and then 4 sets of rows on another day. That would add up to 4 fractional sets.
God damn.
Granted, that might go up as you get more and more trained, but conceptually, to see detectable, measurable hypertrophy doesn't take a ton, right? So that's one way to look at it, is like, that's awesome.
That's great.
Extraordinary, right? But at the same time, someone looking to eke out as much as they can might also be encouraged by, okay, we do see more and more hypertrophy as you add sets. So as long as these kind of, I'll just sum them up as indirect negative consequences, deloading more often, maybe even things like mood disruptions or sleep disruptions. As long as I'm, monitoring those and those are taken care of, I can do more volume and probably benefit from it. Again, I can't emphasize enough being mindful of some of those indirect negative consequences and, kind of have that lever to pull if I do want to increase the rate of my hypertrophy. So I kind of view it as like, again, I don't identify with a low or a high volume camp, but I kind of view it as a win for both in a way.
Yeah. And it's not even, because a lot of guys will say, oh, win for both. See, everything fucking works, brother. You just got to do what feels right for you. And there's totally awesome reasons to think some of that's true, but it's like both are awesome, but in their own way. One is the easy entry point for gains is super low, and you're going to make great gains training not so much. The other is, if you want to look back on your last show placing as a 37-year-old and go, I fucking did everything I could, you had better had been pushing those volumes high, because we know you can probably recover from 20 or 30 or whatever sets per week and still get benefits. So if you're one of these guys that are like, my biceps just won't grow, we look at your program and it's been low volume the whole time, you'd be like, low volume is great and it works really well. But if you are interested in training off fatigue and quality of life or whatever the hell to train your biceps all the fucking time, it's also going to be a thing you can definitely do.
Yeah. And here's the cool thing to piggyback off that, the cool thing about our analysis is that we didn't find strong evidence of that inverted U concept where you see additional hypertrophy at plateaus and then you actually see worse hypertrophy. Maybe we get more data, maybe the inverted U is correct. That's totally possible. But as it stands right now, that doesn't seem to overwhelmingly be the case. I think that's really encouraging from a troubleshooting perspective, or from a perspective of someone trying to milk out as much progress as they can, especially if they're time constrained, like someone at the end of their lifting career. Because if the inverted U was right, or if
for sure a thing.
Exactly. If the inverted U was for sure a thing, then it would kind of be this insidious thing where you wouldn't know at any point in time, am I, doing too much? And I could be getting more progress if I decrease my volume by 5 sets per week. It doesn't seem to be the case. It might happen practically if, again, some of those indirect negative consequences, like deloading more often.
You would know that.
You would know that.
You would know, okay, this is one of the things I use like a heuristic at RP to help people figure out their volume. If you are recovering in every way that you understand the term, like your soreness heals before your next workout, you feel strong again, you're motivated, the muscle's not frayed and the tendons are all fucked up, and you perceive the volume as like, I can fucking survive this is fine, I can do it again. If all those things align, doing more is probably the best idea for if you want to crank the growth more. But if you're not recovering in all the obvious ways, I don't know if I'd bet on doing more.
Right. As you do more, you just might increase the risk that you're getting the same results you would have gotten at a lower volume.
Yes.
Right. And then you just got to be mindful of those practical things, recovery being reasonable, motivation to train being in a good spot. And in a lot of ways, the fact that it's not an inverted U simplifies programming, I think, a lot.
A ton.
Yeah.
A ton. The inverted U would still be tractable problem if you continue to increase volume, but then your strength started coming down, and then your recovery was really in a bad way. Then I would still say, like, just heuristically, probably less will work better. But then, like, if you really dive deep into the theory, like, no, but actually you could still be recovering in a way that you hate, but still be growing more muscle. So you'd have to really experiment with objective muscle growth criteria, which is so difficult. We need to do MRI your bicep. You're not gonna do that. And so the inverted U, I think, probably exists. It almost has to in theory, but maybe it's at 50 and 60 sets per muscle, to the point where, like, you have a rhabdo and you're like, right, okay, that's how I lose muscle. It's probably more out there. And in my experience, most people will get stopped by either systemic or local fatigue factors seemingly before they reach that. Not everyone.
Yeah, well said. When we got these results, I was like, I had the exact same thought. I was like, man, has muscle atrophy ever occurred as a result of doing too much? And I just wanted to see, like, is that possible? Because, like you said, I think the inverted U has to exist.
You're not going to do 150 sets for your biceps and just plateau growth.
Right.
Something's going to get fucked up.
Right.
You can't push any organ system beyond a certain volume of anything and it have, like, maintain its integrity.
Yeah.
However, it's a very different story that, like, 25 sets in, the inverted U starts slowly creeping down versus like 55 sets in, and there's, like, every time you train, you have like red pock marks appearing on your skin. Like, I think I'm dying. Like, nah, man, just keep pushing the volume. Yeah. Two very different things.
The cases where it has been documented where muscle atrophy occurs, and therefore clearly you're on the other end of the inverted U, is from more of what I would kind of think of in my mind as like muscle injury studies.
Yes.
So taking people off the street that have never trained before, so the repeated bout effect, think of the first time you squatted, you're sore for like a week, right? So that sort of training status, and then having them do dozens of maximal eccentric bicep curls.
Yes.
Those are the sorts of things that, okay, now we're clearly doing too much. So just because there's no inverted U in these training programs in the research, when you kind of pool them all together, doesn't mean it doesn't exist in theory. Kind of what we're saying, I think, is that within a reasonable training program.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you get an IRB for that one? Like, can you ensure the subjects will be safe? You're like, no, not really. They might never use their arms again. They're like, fuck it. Go ahead and do the research.
Yeah. Don't quote me on this, but I think I remember coming across some measurements where it's like resting elbow angle. So, like, in other words, there's so much soreness.
Yes.
Yeah. Where it's like, man,
They were walking around.
They're
like
walking
this
around exactly
for a few days
because they're so sore.
I've had that happen to folks like that are new to training. Like you can't brush your teeth the day after because your arm doesn't work. That's definitely like, I think if it happens once, you're probably okay. If it happens consistently, you're probably just being an idiot and you're asking for not great things to happen. I can't definitively say that as a scientist, but like, come on.
Yeah, it's going to be obvious. I think it's going to be obvious.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing stuff. Frequency. Frequency means in your analysis that we are seeing how many times per week are we training the same muscle, and how does that pan out for 10 to 12 weeks of growth? And that 10 to 12 weeks of growth, I'm sure we'll come back to it later, but like that's a big deal because volume, we know at certain levels is unsustainable. We for sure know certain frequencies are unsustainable. Just to put this in perspective with a quick one-off story, though there are many stories like this. And if you guys have stories like this, throw them in the comments. I had a friend who did the squat everyday program. He started with a squat max of 275, and over 6 months, he got a squat to 405. Look, that's pretty fucking sweet, right? Squatting every day. So then afterwards, he his hips and knees started hurting. And in a way that that just doesn't go away right after the workout, he had to back off of squatting a little bit. And then every single time, as by the way, they hurt for months afterwards. And every single time his squat goes back up into the mid 300s, or he starts to inject higher volumes, his body falls apart. And that's like years later after he did that. Like he permanently fucked himself up by just pushing it way beyond, and like some kind of like reflexive inflammatory process in his joints is like, no, you ever touch us again, you're like a dog you beat a lot and keep in a cage dark room, and he comes out and your family adopts him. As soon as the lights go off, he's biting somebody. Like that's basically what happened to the dude. So I've heard a lot of other stuff like, Smolov and shit like that, these programs. The sustainability psychologically for them, joint and connective tissues, that's something you typically don't measure in laboratory. You measure muscle, hypertrophy, cross-sectional area, whatever, and you're like, oh, so it goes up. And then you ask the guys like low-key, like, how are your joints? They're like, I'm never lifting again. And you're like, right, okay, so we probably shouldn't recommend this to people, even though it shows like, oh, the more frequency you do, the better, the heavier you go, the better, all that stuff. So that rant bullshit from me aside, what did you guys find with frequency and hypertrophy, and how did you kind of go about the analysis?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think of it from a sustainability perspective as well, because the good news with our main model results for the effects of frequency on hypertrophy is just that it wasn't all that strong. So we did see an effect for going from 1 to 2 times per week for a given muscle. But if I were to put my scientist hat on, I can't say that is like a very consistent, strong effect. So if we were to just kind of like put it in perspective, the benefit in isolation of taking a given volume and spreading it and doing it in 1 session versus 2 sessions, so spreading it out more, that benefit is about the same in magnitude as going from 10 to 12 weekly sets. So nothing crazy there.
Notable but small.
Notable but small, and also quite inconsistent, which I'll circle back to in a second. But anyway, past 2 times per week, man, there's not a whole lot going on there in terms of additional benefits of frequency. So the thing to keep in mind here, though, is that in practice, higher frequencies might lead to higher volumes, right?
Yes.
And then we get back to our discussion on volume itself. So in our research, basically what we did is we said, we're only going to look at frequency independent of everything else. Right? Which is important.
Deriving principles perspective.
Right. So just because we don't see a clear benefit of training 2 to 3 times per week compared to 1 time per week, that doesn't mean that you should only train once a week. In fact, it's probably neutral positive to be slightly above 1 time per week. But also, it's pretty cool because you can also have a feasible program that trains a muscle 1 time per week, and we do see robust hypertrophy from that. So, yeah, I was pretty surprised because when we do these dose response modeling studies, we actually tend to find, like, just have more power to detect things that are truly there. So, for example, my colleague, Zach Robinson, a lot of previous meta-analyses had looked at the effects of proximity to failure on hypertrophy and not really found a whole lot, or at least it was a kind of a mixed bag. But then I think when you put it all together in these cool meta-regressions, things start to present themselves. And I honestly expected that for frequency, because it just makes sense that if you train a muscle more often, you're going to see a little bit more growth, all things held equal. But we just didn't see that, which is interesting. And again, the effects were quite inconsistent. So my mind goes to like, man, I wonder if frequency just really depends on all of the other training variables.
I mean, I can think of a bunch that it can depend on. Like one of them is like what muscle and what exercise you're using. Because if you say to me, listen, okay, so you're training hamstrings, you've got a special modified leg curl that loads more eccentrically than concentrically. It stretches the dog shit out of your hamstrings. And it also is cam leverage so that it's much more difficult at the bottom than at the top.
Cooked for like a week. At least I would be.
Bro,
yeah,
100%. And if someone was like, okay, you have that and properly done stiff-legged deadlifts, and you train Monday and Thursday, what is the result of, in the literal actual world, the volume frequency relationship? So first of all, anything beyond 2 sessions a week is you're doing 1 set per session. The warm-up's just not worth the effort. So 2 a week is good enough. Arguably 1 is good enough. The second thing is, what's the maximum volume that you're going to get a benefit on? Bro, it's like 5 sets per session, maybe 10 sets total per week. Anything north of that, it'd be like, if anyone does these movements properly, they simply will not recover. You're just going to be sore overlapping for 3 sessions straight. You're going to do session 4 and be like, oh, fuck, my hamstring. You're just going to fucking pull something. I've been there before. There's some shit you can't push. The chest, properly done flies and everything, fuck you up. Whereas like side delts, you can do side delt shit to your blue in the face, and it's a same relationship graphically, but like blown up or blown down depending on how much the muscle takes damage and gets stimulated for growth. So looking at stuff for exact sets and exact frequencies is a very important thing, but trying to derive the principles is super important as well, because you can be like, look, we know that the biggest way frequency makes an effect on growth is that it allows you to get in more volume over the week. So if you're not recovered, don't do any more, just recover. Because we already know you're chasing something that's not there. Because people be like, growing my hamstrings, they're sore all the time, I'm barely healing, which is good. But what if I had a 3rd session? I'm like, what do you think that 3rd session is getting you? If you think it's magical frequency fairy dust you're sprinkling out of the shit, we basically know that doesn't exist. There's nothing special about frequency. It's like filling a glass. It takes a little frequency to fill the glass, great. If you can fill it with 2 sessions or even 1, you're good to go. But on the other contrary side is, if you are training side delts and you're training them with 4 sets per session, it is absolutely conceivable that you can train them 5 days a week, because that's 20 total sets, and that's nothing to run home about and be crazy. Like, oh, you can actually train even more. And if your joints are healing and if the muscles are fresh every time you're going, then someone who tells you like, yeah, man, you got to fucking train shoulders just once a week. You're like, why? Like, you really going to do 20 sets of shoulders in one workout? You could, but first of all, it's fucking boring. And second of all, like, do the shoulders as a muscle need that long of a time to recover? Like, if you train 20 sets of shoulders in one day, and then 3 days later, you're ready to go again, should you really wait? Like, no, you're kind of ready to go. What do you think about that sort of perspective?
Yeah, the way that I see it is, it's important to keep in mind that in these studies, when I was looking back after I saw this lack of an effect for frequency, again, an independent effect of frequency, I was like, oh, a lot of these programs are just pretty reasonable in terms of that volume frequency relationship. So to your point, it was quite unlikely that if a study was comparing a 1 time per week training program compared to more than that they would be doing 30 sets in that session. Right. So we're basically baking in our assumption, or we're baking into our analysis the fact that these programs look reasonable. And if you're training with higher volumes, you're probably also training with slightly higher frequencies and breaking it up into more sessions, right? Because there's probably a point where, whether there's something going on mechanistically where, okay, additional sets just aren't doing all that much, or at least we see like really strong diminishing returns in terms of the additional benefit you get, or you're just checked out and you're like, I'm done. I'll come back on Thursday.
Mental energy is a thing. In the real world, like, you're not doing 20 sets of quads in one session. You may think you are, you're going through the motions, but if you just split it up into 10 and 10, you could for sure fucking grind those sets harder. And then in the real world, it's going to be like, oh, okay, I don't have research assistants yelling at me to go to failure. I can't do 20 sets reliably and really work hard. I'm going to punt 10 sets to later in the week. So that's a thing, I guess.
Yeah. And frequency just allows you to kind of lean into the art of programming, if you will, and the art of individualization. Because we posted a YouTube video once we got these results talking about them, and I used an anecdote of myself, kind of similar to what you were saying with leg curls and stiff leg deadlifts. I'm also tall, so that probably doesn't help all that much in terms of
I noticed. You don't have to fuck
in terms of the soreness I get from something like stiff leg deadlifts, especially when I take them all the way to the floor. I would rather just do all my volume in one session, be really sore for a few days, and then recover 7 days later and be ready to rock, as opposed to trying to get all fancy with it and train it like 4 or 5 RAR for a bunch of sets so I could break it up into 2 sessions.
Or 3 sessions. You gotta warm up a ton for that shit.
Yeah, but the top most liked comment on that video was someone saying the exact same anecdote, the exact opposite anecdote. So they were saying, I would rather, I just don't like training legs, so I'm going to do 1 or 2 sets per session and just do it 4 or 5 times a week, which, based on our analysis, that's a fine option as well. So I think that's a cool example of you just kind of lean into preferences, lean into individualization, recovery time courses, and it can kind of fit in based on your needs while prioritizing the variables that we clearly have strong dose-response relationships with, like volume and proximity to failure.
Yes. Amazing. I have to say, okay, total respect to that commentator, and everyone has their preference. I just have to say one thing. If you don't like training legs, wouldn't you just get it over with in one session and then not do it the rest of the week? Imagine saying, hey, you hate leg training, right? You're like, yeah.
You're just saying, rip the Band-Aid off.
You're going to fucking, 100%. But someone's like, okay, you don't like leg training, right? You're like, right? I wrote you a program, it minimized it. Like, okay, every day you do legs. You're like, I'm sorry, I think you misunderstood completely backwards what I said. So to me, it's kind of like, fuck. And also obviously practical concerns. If you're not super jacked, you're not super strong, no offense, all of us are on our way. We're just not all there at the same time. If you are in that position, training legs is a matter of doing a 5 bodyweight squats, chilling out, and then doing 4 hard sets of leg extensions, and you're fucking golden for quads. But when you get bigger and stronger, the warm-up process becomes more involved. You're fucking jacked, stiff-legged deadlifts, you don't just go in there and put your weight on the bar and go, right? You're putting a couple plates, and then you're going. That warm-up and lead-in time is
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Yeah. But here's the thing. You can pay that 20-minute cost once a week because then you're already warm. Also, mind-muscle connection, for whatever the fuck that means, you're grooved in, man. You do a couple sets of stiff-legged deadlifts, you're grooved, and then you go and do leg curls. You're already well connected with the hamstrings. They're warm. You don't have to warm up again. You start splitting up a bunch of muscles. If we know frequency as an independent variable isn't super powerful, at least we can probably say that, even if there's something there. Then if you're splitting up your muscles a ton, you got to do a lot of warming up. And then it's if you're good with that and you prefer it, listen, God bless you. It's going to work great. But just, I guess I'm asking people to think about that part too. You know?
And lateral delts are the complete opposite. You could do them first in every single session. And something still feels a little bit off about training a muscle more than 4 times a week. Just to me, that's my opinion. Something feels weird about that. But again,
my joints, that's the answer.
but maybe you could do something like that for some muscles. Again, lateral delts come to mind for me. So it's quite muscle specific from a practical implementation perspective. And to your point, the point of research in general, and especially the way that I think about research, is we're just looking for the principles or the concepts. We're not really looking for these really nitty gritty applications.
Exact numbers,
right? Because at the end of the day, all of in that frequency meta-analysis, we had bicep studies, we had quad studies. There might have even been some pec ones, definitely triceps, right? Totally different considerations from a practical implementation. And for the quad studies, some of them were just leg extensions. Some were leg extensions, Smith squats, hack squats, and leg press, right? Totally different programs. You kind of chuck them all into a model and you get pros and cons as a result of that. You get the general principle or concept, but you also get the con that it's not going to tell me exactly what to do in my program. And that's where you gotta use a little bit of common sense and just mindfulness of some of these consequences if you were to do one set of stiff leg deadlifts 7 times a week.
Because the extremes apply oftentimes in the same person for different muscles. It's like telling someone we did all the research and it turns out income isn't really correlated to happiness, which is true time and time again. But the extremes matter. If you're dirt poor, it's going to make you much happier if you have money. And if you go from making $100,000 a year to going to making $6 million a year, it's gonna make you happier. But if you go from 6 million to 7, you might not even notice. And so sometimes people are like, yeah, on average, you're like, totally. But let's actually look at the curve, because the average could be like one big peak and almost everyone's in there. Or it could look like, well, actually on average, there's some kind of effect, but there's a lot on either side of the curve. So I suppose, as trite as it sounds, more research on exact muscles and their frequency relationships is going to be pretty interesting later down the line when we get that, because it's going to be like, oh, okay, like turns out for some smaller muscles that tend to recover faster, and you actually can recover so quickly that you can get up to these really high volumes by training them more often, and probably in no other practical way.
Yeah, I think kind of some of those multiple interaction studies are definitely interesting, right? You could have within the same study, hey, we want to look at the effects of frequency, and we're going to study biceps or something that is a little bit easier to recover from, and maybe do an exercise that, isn't like a super deep incline curl, for example. But then we're also going to look at hamstrings and do really deep stiff leg deadlifts, really lengthened bias leg curls, and see if the effects of frequency are different within that study. So hopefully things kind of open up and this pushes the field forward in terms of some of those, quite practical questions.
Yes. I have a question on theory. We might not know this. I've seen some data to suggest that this is the case, but it kind of ports into the next topic we're going to talk about. One of the hypotheses as to why frequency isn't this crazy independent variable for growth is that if you do a little bit of training in one day, you get a decent stimulus, some good growth, but you don't get very desensitized to training because you just didn't do a ton. That means the next day, your muscles are still fairly sensitive to training, and you'll get some good gains again. And towards the end of the week, before the weekend hits, you're going to be pretty desensitized to training. And then two days off on the weekend, you're resensitized again. And so 5 days a week biceps works pretty well. But if you train for just 2 sessions a week, if you are saying, okay, how the hell is just training 2 sessions a week going to get us similar results to training 5? And part of the answer might be like, well, you rest so long between sessions that your muscles get really sensitized to growth again. And we already know from other research that once you build muscle, it doesn't just go away super fast. So it kind of hangs around just kind of waiting. But while it's waiting, it's like really, it's doing that meme where it's just like, let me add it, let me grow some shit. So if you try to do a lot of something, it's like, sorry, here it goes, the usual bullshit analogy. Ready? This is the worst one. Scott, I'm hit a new low water mark.
Can't wait.
3, 2, 1. If you or J and the D daily, not every day is like the greatest fucking nut of all time. But if you wait a few days and just J the D twice a week, your shit is going to be all over the fucking place. Like, holy fucking crap. Because that resensitization we know happens for a fact, and, semen production, all that other bullshit. Is there something potentially like that going on as a modulator for why frequency doesn't matter as much as we would think? Because the longer you wait, the better the results of any given session. And that kind of tends to even out the frequency playing field.
The truth is that we don't know. So basically the fundamental question I'm hearing there is that what is the time course at which muscle becomes resensitized to a training stimulus?
And what is resensitization? Right. So fuck it. Let's just go to the next topic.
Yeah. Well, I'll quickly.
Yes, please. Sorry.
We'll do it. We'll do it based on like the example you gave of, okay, you train a muscle 1 time per week, and like clearly there's some time there where you could probably train it again, or at least in some cases. So maybe the reason that 1 time per week isn't way worse than 2 times a week, again, 2 times per week might be a little bit better, but maybe the reason 1 time per week isn't way worse is because the muscle has now become resensitized just over that week.
Yes.
Right?
You're kind of a noob again.
And again, from a research perspective, we just don't know the answer to that question. But it is conceivable because there might even be some reason to believe that, like, if you only train a muscle once a week, you might even have like a day or two at which like the muscle kind of atrophies.
A little bit, yes.
And that gets into where I think the evidence is at for resensitization. So let's quickly define what we mean by a muscle being sensitive, because I think that's important. The way that I think of muscle sensitivity is if you have a given input, or in this case, a given training stimulus or a given workout, what is the response? What is the hypertrophy response? What is the magnitude of that?
How much muscle are we growing from any given amount of shit?
Exactly. An easy way to think about this is a noob versus someone that's been training for 20 years.
Yep. Both do 5 sets.
Right. A noob is going to see a ton of growth. Someone that's been training for 20 years, we're probably not going to be able to detect it over the course of a month, right?
Hypothetically, you grew, but our instruments can't even pick it up because they're so small, which I've heard in my sex life a whole lot.
So we know that the noob is very sensitive to training, and we also know that as you do more and more training, you become desensitized as you've been training for years.
So we know on the grand scale of years and years, this is definitely an extant phenomenon. It for sure happens. It's
Absolutely.
Just not true to say that, like, actually it's all genetics, and if you have good genetics, you'll be infinitely sensitive for forever. Like, people will be walking around at 380 pounds. It's just not a thing.
And that doesn't mean that someone that's been training for a while can't continue to gain muscle. It's just going to slow down, right? Of course. So the question becomes, is there a way that we can move the chess pieces around the chessboard in order to renew some of that sensitivity to muscle gain? So that's where the term resensitization comes in. And let's think back to that example of only training a muscle 1 time per week. Let's say you do lose a little bit of muscle. Obviously, it's not going to be detectable, but just hypothetically, there's a little bit of loss of muscle before you train it again. Muscle seems to be extremely eager to regain what it used to have. Mm-hmm. Right. So a really good example of this is a study by Ogasawara and colleagues. I think it was from 2013, very well cited. And we actually have some recent research from the last 6 months, two studies in particular, that have kind of reaffirmed this concept. But the Ogasawara study is very well designed. They used really good measurements of muscle hypertrophy. So I think it demonstrates the concept well. So they had one group train consistently for 24 weeks. Mm-hmm. The other group trained 6 weeks on, took 3 weeks off.
I love that
completely. Study. Then they went back to training for 6 weeks, off for 3 weeks, back to training for 6 weeks. And basically what you see is that after the 3 weeks off in that periodic training group, they were, again, those muscles were really eager to regain what they lost, right? Now, here's the question, and here's the open question in the scientific community is there a way to either take time off or take time with reduced training to end up at a higher point?
Yes, because they both ended up at the same point.
They ended up in the same point. So that detraining, it did resensitize the muscle, right? Because you saw a greater response to the input upon returning to training. But they didn't end up at a greater point. So the question is, are they just regaining what they lost? Mm-hmm. And we don't know. I'm currently in progress of a study looking to get some insight into that exact question, but I don't have the evidence to say right now that you could take a month at maintenance and then renew your sensitivity to training. But I can say if you took a month off, you're going to be resensitive to gain whatever you lost.
Yes. So we can't conclude yet from the research literature that in some straightforward linear way, we can futz with the variables and use the resensitization mechanism to get better gains in the same unit time. Definitely not clear yet. We just don't know.
We just don't know.
Okay. However, just based on that 2013 study, obviously we're not basing things on one study at a time, but it's been confirmed through a few different studies. We have a lot of other direct evidence this is a thing. We can, I think, already draw some very compelling conclusions, tentative, of course, about how you can design your training in a way that you might not have conceived of before that's better for you long term. I'm going to throw some of them to you. You let me know if this passes your filter of like, well, that seems like it could be, or like, Mike, shut the fuck up. You're on drugs again. You're on a podcast. Scott, you still with me?
I'm still here, Daddy.
What's he doing back there?
I don't know. He's way too hidden for my comfort.
Oh, 100%. Look, last time I was in a basement room with cameras and a man behind a curtain, the FBI busted through and said that I was a victim of some kind of crime. I felt safe, but they beat that man senseless, you know.
Got a lot of money out of it.
Yeah, that's right. I did get paid. And the FBI never even took away my money. They're like, kid, the least you can do is keep this money. You're like, all right. Like, don't Google yourself.
Always works out.
Always works out. So, to me, the following hits with that study design and the idea that Functionally, what happened was both groups engaged somehow in the training process for 24 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
One group for a total of, is it 6 weeks?
6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, if memory serves.
3 weeks off, and they did that twice. So there was a total of 6 weeks where they didn't train.
Yep.
And the other group trained 6 weeks more.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Bingo.
So in a 24-week period, another way to look at this study, because the negative way, which is valid, is like, resensitization isn't fucking magical and it doesn't like get you to gain more. But the other positive way to look at it is this. We've devised a system of training that can let you train 6 weeks less in a given 24-week period and get you the same fucking gains, which you would think about like, well, okay, but how's that revelatory? Well, hold on. You could spend those extra 6 weeks focusing on another muscle group. You can spend those 6 weeks resting and relaxing and gearing back up to go fucking extra hard. Because what wasn't tested and what could have been tested is we push two groups of people to their best ability to recover in a 24-week period. One group of people trains for the entire 24 weeks. One group does the same study design where they get 3-week breaks. But when you're pushed to your absolute limits, we could surmise that if you get a 3-week break every now and again, you're going to be able to climb higher every single one of those little instances. Psychologically, number one, maybe physiologically as well. And so when we think about how most professional athletes train at like the Olympic level, like Bulgarian fucking weightlifting program, etc., active rest and program periods of lower volume are a huge component. Because like if you thought you knew something and you were like, I'm just going to train for 52 weeks of the year as hard as I can and be the Olympic champ, you got another thing coming. That's not how it works. So because a lot of people would have said, look, if you give them a week off here and there, yeah, they're going to get the same results or even better. Not a lot of people would have predicted like, dude, 6 weeks total in a plan, if you're doing nothing, gets you the same result. Even if we can't get them to train harder and gas out more, just the idea that you can train less and get the same result over a lifetime of training just allows you to accumulate less physical and psychological fatigue. Like someone who takes a break of 3 weeks every now and again from training is just going to be more excited about the training process on average after 10 years than someone who's like, you fucking miss a week, man, you lose gains. And that's how burnout happens. Do you think I'm being overly optimistic about that? Or is there something there that like, look, the finding that we can get the same gains with 6 weeks less of training in a 24-week training block means something pretty fucking cool that we could exploit somehow?
In my mind, absolutely. I share that enthusiasm. I'm a little skeptical of dramatic periods of complete time off.
Same.
So, okay, for the purposes of research, it makes sense why they would take 3 entire weeks off, because oftentimes in research, you might kind of take things to the extremes for
purity.
Exactly. So I think the natural question for me or for the average listener is, what if I just took 1 week off, right?
Or like a deload week where you come in like twice and lift super light.
So that's exactly my thinking is that Ogasawara study we've alluded to, awesome study. I would want to see 3 or 4 more to the point where I would be like, yes, I feel comfortable with you regularly taking a month off.
You're taking a month off. Your friends are like, aren't you going to hit the gym? Like, nah, man, I'm fucking making gains right now. They're like, are you sure about that?
Exactly. You might like just get out of a rhythm with your day-to-day schedule. I think there's some practical considerations there as well. But to your point, I think there should be enthusiasm around this. I'll just kind of group it together as like volume cycling. And I think the natural question is, what about like deload type training or maintenance training? Because we do know that you don't need to do a ton to maintain what you have built.
Yes. As a matter of fact, we know that you need to do very little. Like, it's not just like, it's like half. It's like a third of the typical volume nearly guarantees that you won't lose gains. And the fatigue imposition of a third of your volume is a big deal than the full volume.
Yeah. And it obviously depends what volume you were at. Because if you were at 3 sets and you cut it down to a third, and now you're doing 1 set, it's a little different. But, if you're doing 25 sets, a relatively
15 versus 5,
right,
you're good to go. Yeah.
Right. I there's from the kind of in-house analyses we've done on maintenance, I feel relatively confident that somewhere around like half of the volume you were doing before for a trained individual, so long as you weren't doing a really low volume program, is enough to maintain. So let's take that concept of, okay, we can do less and maintain and maybe still get some of the potential benefits of enhanced growth, kind of that resensitization effect upon returning to higher volume training. Again, from a research perspective, we just don't know.
Sure.
But I'm about halfway through data collection of a study that's basically a replication of that Ogasawara study, but instead of taking time off, they're taking time at maintenance volumes.
Beautiful.
So the question is, okay, maybe we get to a higher point as a result of kind of resensitizing the muscle while maintaining. Then you don't have to spend all that time that the participants in the Ogasawara study did regaining the lost ground. And here's another interesting thing is, let's say that resensitization, when we've seen it in the research, is literally just regaining lost ground. That very well might be the case. And I have my weeks, my months where I tend to think that's the case, to be honest with you. What I will say from the data I've collected up to this point, I haven't analyzed any of the scans or anything. We're still doing data collection. So, we have all the muscle size of from the participants, but we have a pin in that. I have done interviews with the participants that have completed the study up to this point and asked which they enjoyed more. And right now, it has been like 80% folks have preferred the cycled volume condition, where you spend some time at maintenance volumes, go back up to higher volumes. And this is very subjective, so I wouldn't put too much stock into this. But in the cases where people have had like aches and pains from training, it has been when they're doing the same volume week after week. And in our case, it's a 20-week long study.
Fuck, 20 weeks. Have you ever done 20 weeks straight of progression? I don't know if I have, man.
Yeah, and that's where my mind, to your point, that's where my mind is at with volume cycling right now. And again, I'm just kind of grouping volume cycling into things like deloads, things like introductory weeks where you kind of ease back up into training. A lot of people do that, and I think that's for good reason. I don't think I can confidently say at this time that it's because of some inherent resensitization effect, and therefore you're just going to grow like a weed after deload from a muscular perspective. I do think that's a good move long term, but for indirect reasons.
At least for indirect reasons.
Right.
Like psychology.
I want people chomping at the bit after a deload, ready to rock.
Yes. And also, from whatever inklings we have from the injury literature and the wear and tear literature, although it's not great, we know that like consistent bludgeoning with high volumes and intensities for long periods of time is like nearly a surefire way to multiply your probability of getting fucked up. But that occasionally taking periods of lower training can allow long adapting structures like tendons to grow, where usually they would just be like outpaced by muscle. So all that taken together, the psychology side taken together. The other interesting thing, and I did mention this a little bit, is the opportunity to like focus on other muscles. Like, for example, if you really didn't buy this whole resensitization shit at all, not even in the resensitization, the best case of like it gives you extra gains, but in the case of like, if you maintain with very low volumes and you come back to higher volumes, you regain, you don't lose any muscle, and you're back on the gain train, slightly muted, but still back on, no problem. If you don't buy that, you're going to always, and I used to train like this, OCD training style incoming. I thought if I'm not pushing every muscle to make gains, I'm fucking wasting my time. And then prioritizing became a non-entity because like I'm pushing everything all the time. But if I realized that if I pushed my biceps for 20 weeks straight versus if I pushed them for much of that time, but some of that time I was pushing my triceps instead, I would actually get the same bicep gains, but have an opportunity to also bring up my triceps. That's a big unlock, theoretically, that I think if it works out, it seems to be, but maybe not. If that works out, then it's like, it gets people away from that idea of you're either gaining muscle or you're losing muscle. If you ain't training it, you ain't gaining, then you're losing it. There is a situation that even if you lose it, it comes back so fast. Like right now, I'm not training my legs hardly at all. It's psychologically very painful, but I'm able to train my upper body so much that I've been able to drop my steroid doses down to like literally replacement levels from much, much higher. And I'm still roughly the same size and strength in my upper body, even a little bit bigger. Well, no shit, I'm training it so much more. And the recovery quality is so much, because legs fuck you up in a real special way. They'd affect everything else in the week. And I know, I'm betting, that when I come back to leg training, like literally months or even longer from now, they're going to fucking resprout like crazy. And I've seen this happen in tons of pro bodybuilders. Like, you know who Branch Warren is from back in the day? He didn't train his legs for 1 year. Then he trained them for like a few weeks and they were as big as they ever were. First of all, it's his godlike genetics. But second of all, like, that's just a real thing that happens in the real world. And if you didn't know that you could leverage that to your advantage, you would be constrained to thinking you always had to crank it. Otherwise, you're losing.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, man, with a lot of concepts in exercise science, you can kind of view it from two angles. So in the case of volume cycling or time off, it's just so, I think, comforting and helpful to know that any muscle that might be lost is going to be eager to be regained. That is massive applicability, right? A week off for the holidays.
Who gives a shit?
Whatever, right?
Because toss OCD assholes. I don't know if you're like this, but like, if I'm at Christmas dinner and I know I'm losing muscle, I'm no fun to be around. I need a fucking gym. Someone break me into a gym. I know they're all closed. I got to get in and do this shit.
Yeah.
But if you realize, like, dude, it's no big deal. You're going to get it all back, no problem. And you're not going to lose any net time in your career to exploit that. Who gives a shit?
Yeah, and of course you can overdo that to the point where you're taking 6 months off a year. You're overdoing the benefits we can get from this concept of regaining any lost ground quite quickly. But yeah, categorically, I very much agree that, you know, that can just chill you out a little bit of periods of non-optimized training. But another angle to view this volume cycling data that we do have is that you could explain all resensitization or all volume cycling data from the lens of regaining lost ground, and therefore something like specialization phases might just be beneficial for practical reasons, not physiological reasons. I'll give you an example. There's a study that was published within the last couple weeks or maybe 3 weeks ago. I believe the lead author was Moreno. It was out of the University of South Florida. And they took participants and they asked them how many sets of curls they were doing per week up to that point. And they had, and the average was 7 sets per week, I believe. One of their arms continued to do 7 sets per week. The other arm saw an increase of 2 sets per session, so up to 11 sets per week. So the idea is kind of like a specialization phase. Okay, I was doing slightly lower volume. Now I'm going to increase it, not a ton, but meaningfully. Does that enhance growth? Just that increase in volume itself. In this case, it didn't. We do have a study from Scarpelli and colleagues, which has been pretty well cited, that kind of showed the opposite, where, you know, just a 20% increase in training volume in and of itself seemed to enhance muscle growth. So again, I can't sit here in good faith and say that like something like specialization where you kind of, do kind of blast upper body and maintain lower body and then alternate back and forth, that's going to enhance your gains from a physiological muscle growth perspective. But there very well might be cases where it's practically helpful just because of, you know, you can only do so many muscle groups first in a session.
Sure. Or total like systemic fatigue. So we know compellingly, actually from our conversation just before this, that if you have an ability and recovery is fine, you can go in excess of 20 and maybe even 30 sets per muscle per week and still see marginally higher gains. But you can't do that with quads and hams and glutes and adductors and chest and back in a whole body program, especially once you get bigger and stronger. Like if I challenged you to train every muscle at 30 sets per week, you'd be like, okay, 2 weeks later, you'd be like, fuck you, I'm out.
Yep.
So knowing that muscle is really easy to regain, you could split half your body and really pour the fucking shit down for half of it, maintain the other half, and then switch. And then actually we do end up getting theoretically more long-term gains because you're able to walk into those green fields of high volume, keep the gains, and then come back and do it again. Whereas if you try to train everything all at the same time, the systemic fatigue cap would be so pertinent that you actually would never be able to train at those high volumes per muscle group. Because you don't grow whole body, you grow per muscle. And if you can't grow your whole body at the same time because there's too many muscles, splitting it wouldn't work if you lost all the muscle and then regain was just as hard as the gain initially. Well, you're just like losing one, gaining the other. But if we know that regain happens easy and we know the maintenance is pretty easy, we might be able to get to a point where the benefit isn't that there's some physiological mystery. The benefit is that you can just expose the local muscle to periods of much higher volume than normal, which raises its new baseline. Compelling? Possible?
Possible. The open question in my mind is, what if you just did a balanced program most of the year?
Sure.
I could see an argument from both sides. I think training advancement might change my answer, right? Because if you have someone that does just kind of need to put everything into a few muscles at a time to see any growth at all.
Yes.
Okay, now your model might make a little bit more sense.
Yes.
But if you take someone that's, just been training for a couple years and they're worried about going from 12 sets per muscle of just everything, right? Which is a very reasonable volume, probably seeing really good, reliable growth, progressing steadily. And then they start overthinking it and try to go up to 30 sets per week for a couple muscles and everything else down to 4 sets a week, and then kind of cycle between those high and low volumes for different muscles. I think that A, adds complexity that might not be necessary, and B, we got to keep in mind those diminishing returns of going from 12 to 30 sets.
Yes.
Right? So going from 4 to 12 of those muscles you just decreased would be more robust than going from 12 beyond,
yes.
right? Because of those diminishing returns. So again, I think the resensitization stuff is, interesting for time off and can ease any worries about any loss gains if you do take an approach like this. But we have to keep those diminishing returns in mind, in terms of those increases in volume. And I think a good just starting point for most people most of the time is a balanced program.
Of course.
But then once there are some of those practical constraints, whether it's time, just how many quality sets you can do in a session and therefore per week. Okay, now we might start to entertain moving the chess pieces around the chessboard and really specializing a muscle or two at a time. And we do see that in pretty high level lifters. So, that's kind of a point in the column for this volume cycling approach.
Yeah, 100%. That makes a ton of sense. All right, next topic. You ready?
Let's do it.
Power building is a thing. It's like the unicorn of training, because for most people who start lifting and get really into it, if you're like, do you want to get really jacked? They're like, yes. And like, do you want to get really strong? They're like, yes. Mm-hmm. And so ideally you'd be that guy that had enormous pecs and could incline 500 for reps. If someone said there's a really great way of training, gets you huge pecs, but your incline's going to be like every other regular person, you'd be like, man, is that really true? Or if you're like a sleeper that can incline 500 for reps, but like you put on a t-shirt and people are like, it's just a regular guy. You're like, but how am I supposed to impress the ladies? It leaves me nothing. So power building, the ability to increase your strength and your size roughly at the same time, and a good measure of both, is very, very appealing, right? But there are a few problems with it, which I have videos about, and one of them addresses this thing we're going to be talking about, which is that the amount of volume that you benefit from for growth maximally seems substantially higher than the amount of volume you benefit from maximally for strength. And then you're left with the question of, do I hit the volume between those two for the best overall gains? Do I cycle between those volumes? And is there any way for me to get the best of all worlds? And because they're two different volume optima, the answer doesn't seem to likely be that, like, actually in this one way, you can have it all, because you're just aiming at two different targets. It's like someone's like, how am I the most jacked and the best at endurance running? You're like, I think if you hypothesize jackedness as a backpack that's on you all the time, 20-pound backpack, man, the world record on the marathon can't run the fucking marathon as usual times with that thing on. It's just a matter of physics at that point. let me know what you are finding in the research literature and how this question is being approached and what answers we can get out of this. My ideal answer is like, I found a way to do it all. I suspect that's not.
I'll try to take an optimistic lens here, because I know when I got into lifting, and kind of in that era, power building was the stuff, man.
Yes.
Everyone wanted to get, like you said, jacked and strong. Whereas people seem to specialize a little bit more these days.
Yeah.
Which probably I would tend to agree with you that it might be hard to eke out everything out from a physique or a hypertrophy perspective if you're also trying to compete in powerlifting twice a year, right? And same concept goes the other way around. But at the same time, I think it's helpful to think about powerlifting because I think it's cool. I think a lot of people think it's cool. Mm-hmm. And I also think that some people are just drawn towards big compound lifts, and that gets them excited to train. Mm-hmm. And I think there's kind of this crowd of power builders we gotta give some love to.
Sure.
And the reason I'm going to take an optimistic lens is because some of the data that we've published on this, because like you said, strength and hypertrophy are different outcomes. If they were the same thing, we could just measure strength outcomes and assume that that's also what maximizes hypertrophy. We know that's not the case. For example, proximity to failure, how many reps in reserve you have at the end of a set. That seems to be an important variable for hypertrophy. So you want to train nice and close to failure for hypertrophy. But for strength, it seems to literally have no effect so long as you're lifting the same weight, right?
Yeah. If you're lifting heavy weights, if you do 5 singles, or if you do a set of 5 with the same weight, one of those was RIR 4, one was 0.
Which is the opposite for hypertrophy.
Right, exactly. Functionally, for strength, you would see the same result. For hypertrophy, you would see like very substantial differences where you were like, fuck, man, why'd I do all those singles? And I could have just one set of 5 and actually grown more.
Exactly. So if I were to kind of like boil down from the research we have right now, and again, kind of leaning onto meta-analytic data, for hypertrophy, reps in reserve or proximity to failure seems to be quite important, convincing from a research perspective. Volume as well seems to have some sort of dose-response relationship. And then also there are certain exercise selection principles that are important for hypertrophy. Those are kind of the big 3 in my mind. Of course, there's other variables as well, but those are the ones that are the most consistent in the research. From a strength perspective, the number one thing seems to be specificity of the movement.
Yes.
So if you want to get a stronger squat, you should squat. Crazy concept, but it is worth emphasizing because that is just so consistent in the research.
It's your sport practice.
Exactly.
Imagine training for gymnastics, but not doing any gymnastics. It would get confusing.
Yep. The other variable that seems to be quite important is the load in relation to your max. So the percentage of your 1 rep max.
It's the definition of strength is lifting heavier. You don't ever endeavor to live heavier.
Whereas
it's confusing.
Hypertrophy, the load itself, so long as proximity to failure is in a good spot, doesn't seem to matter quite as much. And the last one is frequency for strength.
Yes.
So we actually saw a pretty strong relationship between additional frequency and additional strength gains. It probably plateaued beyond 3 times per week. So somewhere in that 2 to 3 times per week range seems to be a good number of times per week to do the specific lift that you want to get better at. Whereas for hypertrophy, frequency doesn't seem to matter quite as much. So point being here is we have different variables kind of driving the outcomes for hypertrophy and the outcomes for strength. But here's the cool thing. And again, I've become more and more optimistic about power building as a result of this. If we look at the dose-response relationship of additional sets per week and additional strength gain, it's really strong from about 1 to 5 sets per week. That's it.
So let's put that in practical terms. If you're squatting heavy with 1 set per week, you're going to get way better results squatting 2 heavy sets per week.
Yep.
And notably better for 3 and for 4 and for 5. Mm-hmm. After 5, what happens?
After 5, you seem to get really strong diminishing returns. From a statistical scientist hat-on perspective, I actually can't say that beyond 5, you're going to see meaningful additional strength gains, at least in the studies that we have. But marginally, directionally, I think the actual plateau is probably closer to like 7, 8, 9 sets per week.
Yeah, and that's context dependent on the individual and all this other stuff.
Exactly. But basically the point is, like, high volume does not seem to be necessary to maximize strength gains, or let alone to see robust strength gains, because we saw really good strength gains in our recent meta-analysis just from doing 1 set per week. So
a lot of people train like that. They work up to a top single.
Exactly.
Go to assistance work.
Exactly. So this is great news for people that are interested in concurrent hypertrophy and strength training. Again, is it the best way to maximize every gram of muscle growth you can? Probably not, but some people are okay with that trade-off. And the good news is you don't have to do bone-crushing powerlifting training, benching 5 times a week for, 6 or 7 sets per session, or some crazy program like that. We can see really good strength gains from low volume programs and without having to train super close to failure. Now, you're going to have to train with pretty heavy loads, right? But you could start a power building workout by just doing 1 to 4 sets of the specific movement that you care about, and then just go do a good hypertrophy program. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be a great program for power building. Is it going to get you to nationals for powerlifting? Probably not, but very encouraging. And I think that can get someone pretty far along their strength potential.
What I've said before is, if you like to train like that, heavy work first, hypertrophy volume work after, it's going to work until it doesn't. And so do it. And if you're getting great strength gains and size gains, and you like those gains, you like the trade-off, fucking rock on. For years, it can help you. But if you are eyeing a powerlifting meet, it probably is a good idea for the next month or 2 or 3 to kick the hypertrophy work down to super maintenance levels and really make sure you're taking the time to recover and focusing on strength work. Mm-hmm. Whereas also, if you have a bodybuilding show in 16 weeks, can you imagine going up to heavy singles when you're 3 weeks out of a show? Like, this is probably not wise for a variety of reasons. And it does beat you up and it does fatigue you. And, you need a lot of mental fortitude to get through a show prep. And like, if you use most of it on like your max double for the day on deadlifts, like the rest of your back workout is like, you're just mailing it in. So then you're like, okay, it really matters how jacked I am. Then it's time for me to focus on one versus the other. But for long-term overall gains, it seems like I can do a good measure of both and get good results. And if the results ever plateau, I always know that hyper-specializing in phases and waves is going to yield some results, because then I can really lean into what I'm doing at any one time.
Totally. And the cool thing here is that once you do your low-volume strength work, you don't have to do the specific movement anymore. You can go do the, nice deep leg press, Smith machine squats for a powerlifter, which sounds crazy, but and from a powerlifting perspective, the good news is that long-term additional hypertrophy is probably going to contribute to additional strength gain. Now, the additional strength you get from the powerlifting movements probably isn't going to do a ton additionally for you for long-term physique development.
I don't know how it would.
I just can't think of a reason, and I just don't think we see that play out in the research. No. But again, to your point, you can go pretty far with an approach like that, and again, especially given the fact that we consistently see really robust strength gains from just quite specific training and low volume and far from failure. And you can ride that for a while, but like you said, you might come to a point where you have to make a decision.
Yeah,
and I think that's normal. That's quite common.
Yes, I think that's awesome. So I said it would sum up like, good news. Power building is going to work pretty well, mm-hmm. and for some time. And another piece of good news, when the power building isn't getting you the results you want anymore in either strength or hypertrophy, you can always pivot and specialize in one or the other for some amount of time and easily come back, reintegrate the old one, and see regains and then new gains. So if you have been powerlifting and bodybuilding for a while, you have a powerlift meet coming up, it's a big deal. Several months of no bodybuilding, and you're going to come back to bodybuilding and you're going to do just fine, mm-hmm. very, very soon. And if you have a bodybuilding show coming up, or you just want to get super jacked for the summer, you can leave behind all of the power lifts, and then it's going to be a rough few weeks,
yeah.
But it's only rough if you are either cranking the weight really heavy at first, or if you're egotistical. Because like, let's say you're squatting like sets of 5 around 400 pounds or so, low bar, the whole setup. If you take 6 months away to just do hypertrophy work only and get jacked, legs and everything, you're going to come back to low bar squats and 315 is going to feel fucking weird for fives on day one.
Yep.
The next week, you're going to do 335 and the last set of 5 is going to fly off your back and you're going to be like, oh.
Mm-hmm.
And the next week, you're going to do like YOLO 365, easy 5s. And then 3 weeks later, you're hitting 425 for sets of 5 and you're like, oh my fucking God, I'm the strongest I've ever been.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed that in your own training, that when you come back to some shit, it's really easy to get
My
discouraged?
adductors get so sore when I haven't low bar squatted in a while and get back to it.
Like, oh, it's an adductor exercise.
Exactly. I think part of this is also like to what degree the power lifts agree with your body and your
Morphology,
proportions,
anthropometry.
Exactly.
Yep.
Your leverages for the lift. Some people can do a nice high bar squat that's pretty specific to a powerlifting squat, and they might even do that if they had no powerlifting goals at all.
That's what I did for years.
Yeah, but some other people are quite the opposite, and a high bar squat or a low bar squat is just far from an ideal exercise for them. So I think that's a big component as well when factoring into this discussion here. But yeah, to your point, I think it's encouraging that, a lot of these concepts kind of come back to the fact that you can regain what you lost quite quickly if you do take some time to specialize. But another cool thing here is that we should really view all of these tools as sliding scales, right? So if you were to take, 6 months completely off of strength training, what if you just took 6 months of doing 1 set per week? Mm-hmm. You might still get weaker, or you might completely plateau, but now you're starting from a much higher baseline when you return.
And your technical ability is really high.
Right.
There's none of that psychological weirdness. You don't have to choose what weight you're going to use and be confused about, oh, is this too heavy? Is this too light? You already have a baseline. Mm-hmm. So it's just like, oh, I used to do 1 set of 315 for 5 for a long time, 315 to 325. Okay, I'm starting back into powerlifting, 2 sets, and 330. And then you already know you're good for it. And then as you go and go, you'll get better and better and better at it.
Yeah, so that's the goal, man, is get the nature of these relationships for each variable and our outcome of interest. So hypertrophy or strength, right? And those variables being volume, load, proximity to failure. Try to understand them. And now for each individual, based on their goals, what gets them going about training, you have someone that really cares about physique, but they also get really fired up about overhead press strength for whatever reason. Totally cool. Now we can kind of, take our constraints, time, fatigue, energy, and make sure everything is dialed in based on what drives the outcome we're looking for.
Yes, 100%.
You want to train right to gain muscle, but there's so much complexity to it. What exercises to choose, what sets and reps to do, how much weight to lift, and how to structure your weekly plan. So much uncertainty that it's easy to get overwhelmed. The RP Hypertrophy app removes all uncertainty and makes the training process precisely defined. Choose your pre-made workout plan from dozens available in the app, plug in your weights, and the app takes care of the rest for months of productive training. Ready? Click on the link in the description of this video to get started.
Very, very awesome stuff. Okay. Related.
Yep.
My note here is monitoring progression /strength gain is limited for assessing muscle hypertrophy. So what I take this to mean is a lot of people will say, okay, in the last 4 weeks, I got stronger in my leg press, which means I for sure am gaining muscle. Now, what I have availed enough to literature, I've been on this bullshit long enough to know that that's not exactly true for a variety of reasons you're no doubt going to explain. But what I like to do is flip that and say, if you have gotten weaker on a lift over time and you've been practicing that lift, you might be losing muscle.
Yeah.
And by might, I mean you probably are. But because there are ways to get stronger without gaining muscle mass, and because muscle mass leads to strength gain, not in pouring sand on a sand pile, but in building floors of a skyscraper, where if you're the skyscraper is 100 floors and all the trucks show up with all the steel beams and the glass and all that shit, and they go into the basement to get into the elevators. And when the trucks go in, you look at the top floor, you're like, still the same height. You're like, there's a process here that takes time. It's delayed. It's not going to happen right away in a detectable way, so that over the long term, strength and hypertrophy are very tightly correlated, but in a medium term mesocycle length, weeks, the relationship is not linear enough to put your whole fucking money on that equation. And that if you end up getting a situation where, fuck man, I was training one guy once and over just distance, and I had him go through a high volume phase to put on muscle, and he tested his bench right after that. And he's like, my bench went down by like 5 pounds. And then he fired me. And I just wanted to find him and choke him to death because I was like, you're so fucking stupid.
Do a strength block. It'll blow up.
God. And, who the fuck knows where that guy went. But like that 1-to-1 expectation of linearity fucked him up and got him to miss a ton of gains. So what did he go? He went back to use the usual bullshit where he trains mostly the neural system, or the nervous system, and he never does enough volume to grow that much. And he's like roughly still the same strength, but still peak strength. He never took a dive. That's my understanding of what the situation is. What have you found in your research? What's going on?
Yeah. Kind of, I think the best way to think about this question is from the perspective of how do we measure or monitor hypertrophy in the real world? And what a lot of folks are drawn towards is progression or strength gain. Numbers, right? Data driven. Lame, right? What were they thinking?
What does it say? We're interviewing a competitor company next. Feelings driven strength.
Feelings driven strength they're gonna eat our lunch someday. But we just have this intuition that a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle. So therefore, I can just monitor my strength, and that's gonna tell me what I want to know about my rate of hypertrophy progress. And there is some truth to that, but there's so many layers to this relationship between hypertrophy and strength. And when I say strength, that doesn't just mean a 1-rep max. That can even mean, how strong were you for your first set of 10 at a 2 RER, right? That's also strength, or you could just think of it as performance. There's so many layers and considerations with that relationship between hypertrophy and performance that we should be cautious, and I think is helpful to keep in mind. And I'll illustrate this difference between hypertrophy and strength with a concept called the cross-education effect. So here's how that might look in a research setting is you have participants train one arm, and let's say they do bicep curls on one arm. They're going to grow muscle. They're also going to get stronger. The other arm doesn't train.
And definitely doesn't grow muscle. We have measurements to confirm there's not a magical way that muscle grows in another arm you haven't fucking touched.
Yep. So the cross-education effect for hypertrophy does not seem to exist, or if it does, it's very, very small. But there is a pretty robust cross-education effect for strength. So in the other arm, you've experienced strength gain, but not hypertrophy gain.
But you haven't even trained it.
Exactly.
So it seems really mystical and fucking cool.
Right.
Maybe the nervous system is involved. I know that sounds crazy.
Yep. So the point here is that there are many factors that contribute to performance. One is
strength, you mean, in this case.
Performance or strength, yep. One is going to be muscle size. Fun fact, that's actually, some people don't believe that to be the case. I don't tend to agree with that, but I'm very open as a scientist to that possibility.
I'm close to that. Fuck those people.
Yeah, I think we could go. I'll spare you the statistics rabbit hole of all that good stuff. But let's just assume that hypertrophy contributes to strength. So that's one component.
In a macro perspective, why do strongman competitors need to weigh 400 pounds to be the strongest? Why does everyone who bench over 400 have big fucking pecs in the grand scheme? Do we think that muscle actually generates force, or does something otherwise mysterious? From the consilience of all those perspectives versus in a 16-week study, we don't see the correlation. To me, one of those lines of evidence is much more powerful. So I think the people that are saying, well, hypertrophy doesn't really matter for strength, they're not looking at the big picture.
Yeah.
But they do have a very good point that in the shorter term, now they often extrapolate that to forever, which is fucking stupid, but in the shorter term, that one-to-one relationship or even close that you're looking for might just not be there because of these other factors that you're talking
Exactly. And that timescale point you made is key. Because in a research setting, you're doing a 10, 12, maybe if you're lucky, a 16-week study. But, if you were to take strength performance at like a powerlifting meet and look at the relationship between strength and muscle mass, it's actually a pretty strong correlation. That isn't necessarily, case closed. It's a perfect causative relationship. But to your point, over long time scales, a bigger muscle is probably going to be a stronger muscle. But there, in the short term, other factors, and this would also apply to the long term, other factors are also going to contribute to strength or performance. So that's going to be neural factors. That's going to be technique, which even for advanced lifters will change over time. And then you also have, especially if you're talking about like a 10 rep max, right? Or something more relevant to a typical training set, you're going to have metabolic factors.
Yep.
Right?
You're good at pacing yourself in the squat.
Yep, exactly. And just buffering fatigue within the muscle itself. And then there's also kind of this fatigue component as well.
Yes.
To your point with the example, I think it was with the bench press. Okay, you do higher volume training, and that strength expression might be a little bit muted until you take away the fatigue, and now performance can really take off.
So the muscle really was growing and really was under the hood making you stronger, but the fatigue was masking that.
Right.
And only when you take a few weeks of lower volume training can you see like, oh shit, but then you can actually conclude the opposite of like, see, the low volume made me stronger. And it's like, it's not what made you stronger. It's what revealed the actual strength. What do you think about architectural factors like fascicle alignment and stuff like that? Obviously a smaller component, but nonetheless something there.
Yeah, it almost certainly contributes. In fact, some of the folks that may question the relationship of or the contribution of additional hypertrophy contributing to additional strength, they would say there very well might be some of those architectural components. So the point we're circling around here is that strength or performance is just so multifactorial that it's very questionable to me when people make training decisions for the purposes of maximizing hypertrophy based on strength gains, especially in the short term.
Based on strength gains, especially by themselves in the short term. Like, you're not looking at all the other variables. You're just like, how strong did I get? Nope, didn't work. Hypertrophy didn't happen. To me, the analogy there is like, so hypertrophy is a subset of strength and not the other way around. Like, strength is three other things plus hypertrophy, whereas hypertrophy is just by itself, just hypertrophy muscle growth. There's nothing else going on. And it's kind of like using somebody's income or wealth as a proxy for their talent. Like, if you're making fuckloads of money all the time, maybe you got some kind of scheme, although to get a good Ponzi scheme going, you kind of fucking have to be a little talented to get that going. So yeah, the money is related to talent, but you can also have a situation where you are in school for like fine art and you are just God's gift to art. Like, you're eventually going to be world class, but your talent's already super high, but you're working your craft. You don't get fucking paid. So we see like, well, how talented could he be? He's not fucking a millionaire. Like, yeah, but watch when he does the thing. So because talent is a subcomponent of your ability to make money, if you just use how much money anyone's making as a proxy for talent, on the average over the grand scheme, you're going to be onto some right shit. But if you think like, okay, someone's like, all right, how's your art coming along? You're like, really good, dude. I think I'm making amazing gains. Like, I'm making the curves better. I don't know fucking anything about art, like the fucking lines. I don't fucking know. Scott, help me out. You're sort of an
art gains.
Art, hashtag art gains. New thumbnail, new title. But like, if someone's like, oh yeah, would you make any more money? You're like, no. And they're like, fucking not getting better. You're like, I don't think that's how it works exactly. So we're missing a big part of the puzzle.
Exactly. Especially in the short term.
Yes. What do you define as short term so folks watching this can figure it out? Weeks, right? At least.
Weeks up to a couple months. And then as you get beyond that, hypertrophy, in my estimation, is, or let me flip that around. As you go beyond, say, 2 months, strength is going to be more indicative of additional hypertrophy.
Right. Because your technique's already pretty optimized. The neural factors, there's only so much you can do on that ground. The architecture is going to be aligned to your lifts that you practice. And now getting much stronger over the long term is really like the machine is fine-tuned. You just need more machine.
Right. Especially if you're doing consistent exercises. Because if you are changing exercise all the time, you basically have to relearn them.
Yes.
Right. And that is going to lead to really robust strength gains.
Yes.
That could happen literally in the absence of hypertrophy.
Yes.
Right. Now,
it could happen while you're shrinking.
Right.
That's
theoretically,
how powerful some of the things
theoretically,
are. 100%.
Yep. So that leads me to my practical recommendations for, okay, we know that hypertrophy and strength are just different things, but we still need something to go off to ensure that our hypertrophy progress is going in the right direction, right? For kind of tracking this thing that's hard to track, which is muscle size. And I think strength can play a role, or performance can play a role if you keep a few things in mind. The first is that you should use what I like to call fingerprint exercises.
Yes, I love it.
And I actually did not come up with that term, so I don't know why I phrased it like that. I definitely stole it. I don't know where it came from. But fingerprint exercises...
Whoever you stole it from is not on this fucking Mega Channel Super Show, so now it's your
mine.
term.
Let's go. Let's go. So fingerprint exercises, which basically just means, hey, you're going to stick with that exercise more or less all the time. That doesn't mean you can't cycle it out at times and take a break, but let's say at least 3/4 of the year, you should have these fingerprint
High bar
exercises.
squatting. You're usually squatting. Sometimes your knees get weird for a block, you pull it out, but it goes back in right after.
Or it could be hack squat.
Yep. Whatever
It's
it
up
is
to you.
You do often.
Right?
Yep.
And therefore, you should have a handful of them to cover the main muscle groups, and keep that in most of the time. And prioritize your progress tracking for those fingerprint exercises, right? The second thing is you want to track progress in the rep ranges used.
Huge.
So if you are doing leg press for one of your fingerprint exercises, you don't need to test your 1 rep max to assess whether you made hypertrophy gains.
Yeah.
But you can assess your performance on sets of 10 at 1 RIR, right? And that's going to be a lot more relevant because you're probably doing somewhere around sets of 10 at 1 RIR for your training.
And proxies better to muscle than a 1RM.
Exactly.
Because a 1RM is much more technique and neural specific. Whereas the nervous system plays a big role in all exertions, but sets of 10, sets of 15, if you don't have the fucking raw size behind the shit, you're not going to technique your way out of that shit.
Yeah.
So it actually is more ecologically, internally, and externally valid for you to stick to core lifts in those similar rep ranges than it is for you to be like, I need to test my strength for this lift. So I'm going to change the lift and do a 1 rep max, which I never do anyway. And it's less specific to hypertrophy, because we get this question all the time. Should I be testing my 1RMs? And almost always the answer is no.
Unless you care about it.
Yes. Yes.
If you're a powerlifter.
Yes. And I still have a caveat there. If you talk to somebody like, Chad Wesley Smith's probably one of the best powerlifting coaches, just period. He'll be like, well, so that's what the competition is for. And then people are like, how do I know I'm getting stronger? Like, dude, well, your sets of 3 and your sets of 5 should go up, motherfucker. Yeah. You don't need to test all the time. Testing for what? Did I get stronger? Aren't your numbers in the gym going up? Yes. Then you're getting stronger. If I do a 5 with my former triple, I don't have to test my 1RM to know I got stronger.
Yeah, I always laugh a little bit when some programs you find require you to input your 1 rep maxes, and you start the program by testing your 1 rep maxes, and therefore you can start the program. It's you could just get to building the strength and
start going.
And if you put, an estimated 1 rep max, and that's totally fine, and you can just adjust it from there. But again, that's for strength. For hypertrophy, you don't even really need to worry about that at all. No. So if you are assessing performance on those fingerprint exercises, if you are doing it in hypertrophy rep ranges that you consistently train in, and if you are looking at it from a long-term perspective, that is going to be the recipe for actually getting insights from strength gain to get some insights into how much hypertrophy was gained.
And there's a real good piece of news, because especially as a intermediate and advanced lifter, you only gain measurable amounts of muscle in the long term anyway. So if you're like, oh man, I got to test my lifts every week to see how much muscle I'm gaining per week, like, bro, if the MRI can't pick it up, your strength won't pick it up either. You're looking for something that's barely there. You might as well just do fractional synthetic rates every other fucking day. And I'm like, oh, okay, you're positive, fucking protein positive, you're good to go. So, because people will be like, so you're really telling me that like how my leg press behaves over an every 6-month period is kind of more the gold standard of size. And it's like, they're like, what if I want to know sooner? Like, know what? That you gained another half pound of muscle? You're asking a question we can't even answer.
Yeah, exactly. And I've definitely been there where, you kind of look at how much stronger did you get on leg press from block A or mesocycle A compared to mesocycle B, and therefore try to draw insights into which of those mesocycles was better for quad strength. Yeah. That is almost certainly a waste of time. And I think...
Or quad hypertrophy.
Yeah, exactly. For quad hypertrophy, I think that's almost certainly a waste of time. I almost think of it more categorically in the sense of, am I moving in the right direction or not?
Yeah.
Right? From a long-term perspective. Because your ability to perform, your ability to display strength is just impacted by so many other things that I really like to think of it as focusing on the inputs of training.
Yes.
And then ensuring over the long term that the outputs, the performance, the improvements in progress photos or circumference measurements,
yes,
or any other metrics you choose to use, those are also moving in the right direction to confirm those inputs are reasonable. But in the immediate term, there's not much more you can do.
No.
And I think that's honestly a point in the column for evidence-based training, because how do we learn about those inputs from the evidence, right? Do what works for you, bro, is true to some degree, but
how do you know it works?
How do you know it works? I think you can get some insights, and especially those practical things like what's sustainable, what causes pain. Those things you can definitely are easy to figure out, and you should, but actually detecting these slight differences that as a scientist in the lab, I can't even say with confidence that like this person did or didn't respond to my training program. If you try to get really into the weeds of strength progression and therefore, quad hypertrophy, chest hypertrophy, man, I think you're gonna waste some time doing that.
You're gonna waste some time, and also you're gonna rest your hopes onto something that will let you down, and that also that causes concomitant confusion and kind of a dissolution of hope, which is kind of fucked. You're like, oh man, my leg press didn't go up this week. I didn't grow. You're like, don't do that. Don't needlessly attach yourself. Anytime, good or bad, you attach yourself to a measurement that doesn't actually measure the thing you want, you're going to have a bad time. Either you're going to get really excited for a while and then get really disappointed, or you're going to get really disappointed up front. Which one do you want? Can I add a couple of those for folks listening?
For sure.
A couple suggestions, more intricate ones. The ones you listed are absolutely the core ones. Looking at your strength numbers for reps, everything you said, but in similar diet phases. Because some guys will be prepping for a show and they're going to be like, my leg press is down. Like, no shit, you don't have any glycogen, motherfucker, and your fatigue is double what it usually is. Because the same guys will be like, man, I lost muscle. 2 weeks after eating up from a show where they've regained a little bit of muscle, they're like breaking PRs like, hey, turns out you didn't lose any muscle. Why the fuck are we freaking out? So same diet phase. And here's another, I think, pretty big one, especially for advanced lifters. The same technique for those exercises is something very similar. Now, your technique will evolve over time. Usually in hypertrophy, it evolves in a way that like will hit the muscle more. Sometimes that actually makes the outcome lower. Like if you come in and train with Jared and I, and we fucks with your leg press technique, you're going to leg press, we guarantee it, less than you ever have, but also you're going to zap your quads more than ever. And it'd be like, oh, God damn it. Does that throw away all my other leg press results? Like, in a certain sense, that's true. However, if you have a very stable technique, I think one very important thing to do, at least to consider, is this. When you are looking at, okay, I'm doing leg press again. This is the 4th time in a year and a half that I'm doing it. My body weight's been climbing. Everything else is going well. I want to see if I'm getting stronger. Don't look at your notepad or your RP Hypertrophy app, because now we have a feature where if you click on an exercise, it shows you all the times you've ever done it and all your best efforts. I argued against that feature. I lost to my engineering team because they're like, people want it, shut the fuck up. So we put it in. Here's why I wasn't a big fan of it. I think it's great, but here's why I'm giving the advice of don't look at it before you're set. If you really got bigger, for sure, your strength will reveal itself organically when you're trying hard. You don't know what you did fucking 4 months ago on the leg press. You're just going. You look through your logbook after you hit a PR or whatever you think was a PR, and you're like, okay, last time it was 395 for 16 reps. This time it's 425 for 18. Holy shit. Whereas if you look at that set, best set before you go, it's a different mentality. You're going to be maybe cutting the range of motion a little bit, maybe bouncing out of the hole a little bit, maybe rushing the eccentric a little bit, maybe a little teeny bit of a rest pause at the top. You know what I'm talking about? You're like, the burn starts to go away a little bit, and you're going back down. And all of those little adjustments, because you're chasing that number, those are technical factors. They're strategic factors. They are metabolic factors. You're getting further away from testing, did I get jacked? Because the truth of the matter is this, if you did get more jacked, pretty much without thinking about it, you're just fucking gonna be stronger. And that's real good evidence to you, because what you want is not, oh, maybe I got a bigger, but man, I definitely got bigger. And if you don't even look at your logbook and you just progress through training like normal and just do good technique, then you look later and you go, oh, fuck, I got way stronger. Yeah, man, you probably got bigger over that long term. Whereas if you have to try game the system, you're doing yourself a disservice. Have you seen that happen before?
Absolutely. I think I can sum up what you just said and what we've been discussing up to this point on this topic is that you want to chase the stimulus.
Yes.
You don't want to chase the outcome itself, because that's impossible to go straight to the outcome without getting the stimulus first. So if you're sacrificing the stimulus in pursuit of the outcome, you're never going to get the outcome you want.
100%.
So that's how we can sum it up. And in my mind, the skill of training, specifically hypertrophy training, is when you can recognize that, but also pair it with a progression mindset.
Yes.
Because a progression mindset to me is vital. So I think it can be helpful to know what your best is on this exercise.
Last week.
Right.
Start with that.
Right. So what your best is ever, or what your best what you did last week, because I think that can keep you honest to make sure that your RARs are pretty accurate.
Challenging yourself.
Right. So kind of this progressive overload, this progression framework that you might follow to have that, but not do it at the expense of the stimulus itself. Once you can pair those two together, it really is kind of like a balancing act between this progression mindset and not sacrificing stimulus. That's where the magic happens in my experience.
Yes. And the more you, after a set that was technically a PR from a few years back, the more you introspect and go, how much did I really chase the number versus taking quality? The more discounting you have to apply to, did you really get more jacked? Because you kind of want to, if you want a convincing story that you got more jacked and be confident with it, I wouldn't say like leverage it against yourself, but don't cut yourself any slack. Don't do yourself any favors. Even pause the reps a little longer than normal. Because if you did a set on leg press this year, whereas last year you have videos of both. Last year grinding, reps are kind of cut a little shallow, some rest pausing. And this year you ever see Nick Walker train? Like a machine, like somebody plugged him in and he's like, oh, mind muscle connection. Exactly. He's the Jedi master of mind muscle connection. I saw him get an incredible workout out of 3 plates on the hack squat per side, legit. And I was like, do I need 6 plates to do that? And this motherfucker's legs are 10 times my size. If you can have a Nick Walker style set and still beat your last rep PR, man, you are in the money. And then you don't have to do this thing where you go home late at night and you tell yourself, I got bigger. And you look yourself in the mirror and you're like, did I though? You don't want that. And as soon as you start gaming the shit too much, like you said,
you're
it's a balancing act. You're avoiding the stimulus. You're just chasing a number. And like that has its place. Chase the number, but in the context of while demonstrating reliably good, honest technique that cuts no corners. It's tough to do in the fucking moment. You want to get a good tracking variable out of strength, you're going to have to do the tough things.
It's probably the biggest thing I've changed my mind on is inputs over outputs or outcomes,
Yes.
then use the outputs from a bird's eye view
Yes, from a long-term bird's eye view.
with appropriate standardization of technique, and to confirm your inputs are moving you in the right direction.
Yes.
Simplifies things quite a bit.
I love that. I can't put that any better. Our final topic. We got Scott. We got us a Milo clone here today. Lengthened, biased. Oh, we got some controversy.
Oh no, Milo
We
and
love
I are
controversy.
no. We've
hate
met. We've hung out.
Milo.
Uh-oh.
It's beef.
No beef.
You hate people of Austrian descent, like Milo.
You're backing me into a corner.
I mean, Hitler was Austrian.
Oh God.
Do you love Hitler? Scott, I don't understand what's going on here. Josh, help me try. It's your face loves Hitler. It'll sell. You're like, I'm famous.
Hey, click is a click.
A click is a click. You're in the airport. Someone's like, you're that Hitler guy. You're like, oh, God damn it. Some lady's like, what's that all about? You're like, lengthened partials. You wouldn't understand.
It's a range of motion thing.
Just like, what? All right. So lengthened biased only training
Yep.
versus mixing lengthened and shortened training.
Yeah.
What's missing there is full range of motion. And since like I like the vibes from full range of motion, because you didn't put this in, I'm upset with you now. And I need my ego stroked about how full ROM is great because something, Dr. Mike. Go on.
Yeah. I'll start by saying the range of motion debate, story, if you will, the arc.
Oh, we're into some anime shit, Scott. It finally happened. Are you into anime? Actual question.
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me because I'm not, and I know that's
Same.
okay.
Guys, just kidding. I love anime. Keep subscribing. Inuyasha or something.
Yeah, so we'll just use the word arc and act like we know what's going on.
Yes. Winter time or winter arc.
Yeah, something like that. It's been really interesting, and I think been a huge net positive on the field. I think you mentioned Milo. I think his work has been great and really pushed the field forward. I think there's been like some pushback on that as well, and
Which is great,
and that is healthy, productive, and is just going to level everyone up, and that's what we want. That is science. Basically, by definition, says that disagreements are a good thing. So that's where I'm at with that from a high level. But specifically in this case, we probably by the time this is out, we will have pre-printed a study from our lab, and huge shout out to my colleague Seth Hinson. He's a PhD student in our laboratory. He's the man, and he did a fantastic job spearheading this study. Because what we did in this study is, when we take a step back and look at the research, a lot of times it's a dichotomous choice between partial range of motion and full range of motion, or more generally, lengthened bias training versus non-lengthened bias training, right? And what we said is, okay, that's cool. That is where you should start. But probably what's a more practical question is, what if we did only lengthened bias training versus some lengthened bias training and some shortened bias training?
So basically like doing bicep curls from here to here only, or doing some of them from here to here and some from here to here.
That's the exact right concept. In our case, what we did is, it was more of a resistance profile study than a range of motion study. So what we did is we had each individual do a different protocol in each arm. So one arm did only incline cable curls. So they were on a bench and they had their arm back here. Therefore, there's a lot of tension in the biceps at a long muscle length.
And the cable was perpendicular to the wrist at the bottom, I assume? So maximum tension and stretch at the same time?
In hindsight, we could have and should have done a better job of that.
But it wasn't vertical.
It wasn't fully vertical. The bummer about research is you kind of design studies like 3 years ago, and then you're like, dang it, like we should have done this different. Yeah. So there are some limitations, whether it was like the absolute max stretch bias exercise you could have gotten, but I feel relatively confident saying it was more stretch biased than the other exercise that was used. So one arm did just those lengthened bias cable curls. The other arm did half of their volume on that same lengthened bias cable curl, but then the other half of their volume doing curls where their shoulder is flexed, putting the bicep in a slightly shorter position. And the cable was aligned so that the hardest part of the range of motion was at a shorter muscle length.
I hate that exercise.
Right. So the question is, okay, length and bias training, on average, there seems to be a slight benefit in the research, whether that's partial range of motion training itself, or it is just making sure you emphasize the deep stretch in the exercise, right? Okay, seems to lean in that direction from a research perspective. But that doesn't mean we have to do all length and biased exercises, or maybe it does. I don't know. So that's where our research comes in. So we had one arm do just lengthened, one arm do some lengthened, some shortened.
What was the volume between the arms? The same and half? How did that look?
Yeah, exactly. So it was the same volume. It was 6 sets per arm per session. So basically 12 weekly sets, pretty moderate volume. And again, in that condition, doing combined lengthened and shortened bias training, it was 6 and 6.
So one arm would do 6 lengthened biased
Yep.
in any given session, and the other arm would do 3 lengthened, 3 shortened.
Yep. Right on.
Excellent. I will say I really like that you guys did the 12 sets total per week, and I'll say why. A lot of studies that are trying to elucidate some kind of advantage of one condition or the other end up running into a problem where their total volume is so low that one condition seems categorically superior to another because that other condition was a little worse as far as hypertrophy, but you're already so low that it just fell below the minimum effective volume. And you're like, see, it doesn't work at all. Like, you're telling me if I do curls from here to here for 20 sets a week, I'm not getting any bicep growth? The fuck up out of here. Like, mechanistically, that strains the imagination. So, on the other hand, if you crank the volume of both conditions very high, sometimes the arm or the group that should have done better on theoretical grounds does worse because it overreaches faster. Like, you get more sore and more fucked up with lengthened bias training, and people are like, see, the fucking shortened biased works better. Like, no, it's because if I had you do halfway down stiff-legged deadlifts in one group and the other group did all the way down stiff-legged deadlifts with a tight back, that if we did 20 sets of stiff-legged deadlifts per week, yeah, the full ROM group would like die or something, or they would shrink, or like we said in an earlier discussion, like at the very least plateau, and you'd be like, see, halfway down works just as well. Like, it's because you're cooking the other group. But with 12 sets, and there's a few other correct answers here, it's that awesome middle ground where we know like doing less would still be effective and detectable, doing more would still be effective and detectable, and both robustly.
Yeah. Yeah. And you bring up an important concept, because one of my biggest critiques of the range of motion or the length and biased research, it's really not a critique because there's really no alternative here. It's just a limitation that I think is worth pointing out is you're really just testing efficiency of training.
Yes.
You're not actually testing, okay, what if I did a practical program with certain ranges of motion compared to another range of motion, because those volumes might be different. But in a range of motion study, you're going to equalize the volume because that's what you should do as a researcher.
Yes.
But then I think that can lead to some pretty strong leaps from practical application that might not be true because of that limitation.
Yeah, because what you find out with proper controls is per dose, how does it work? But per dose is not exactly the only limiting factor in the real world, especially when the fatigue dynamics are different.
Yeah.
Someone's like, well, if I don't do leg curls with a full range of motion, I get less sore and I can do more of them. I'm like, facts. That means you can probably have roughly the same outcomes.
Yeah.
The question is, do you want to spend double the time in the gym? The other question is like, you know, there's some like machines that allow you to do lengthened or middle or shortened biased, like pressing machines. There are some really, really good ones. But what I notice is on the shortened biased presses, it actually like strains my elbows more. And on the lengthened biased, it feels fucking great.
Yeah.
So someone's like, well, you can just do more shortened bias. And then I'm like, but no, I can't because I'll fry my fucking elbows off my body.
Right.
And so I'd love the lengthened bias stuff. So I guess just this part of the conversation between you and I is a bit of an illustration of folks listening or watching that, like, when you see the results of a study, you have to understand them in context. And the amount of applicability to the real world you get from any study is going to be limited.
Yep.
Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little bit. But just like one study, and we talked to Zach about this earlier, of like, if you take in one study and you're running home and screaming at the town of look at this, you're misunderstanding how the fuck science works.
Totally.
So all of that, all those limitations taken into consideration. Sorry to go on a tangent here. Back to the study in reference.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really important tangent because that's how I think about research as well. Yeah, for the study where we had let's just call it the lengthened biased arm and the mixed arm.
Yes.
Drum roll. Go
Scott,
for it.
I was going to say, is mixed the politically correct terminology nowadays? Hey, whoa. It actually is.
Combined training.
Combined. Oh.
Lengthened versus combined training, which...
Just like walking it back.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever doesn't get me canceled.
We're going back to mixed. Drum roll. For our best measure of muscle size, there wasn't a strong indication that one was better than the other. Now, we measured hypertrophy a few different ways, just because more measurements are generally a good thing when you have the ability to do so. But in probably the most robust measurement of hypertrophy, it did lean in favor of the lengthened biased condition. What
was your most robust and least robust measurements of hypertrophy? How many did you do?
There were effectively 3.
Okay.
So
from least robust to most robust.
From least robust to most robust. So least robust would just be arm circumference.
Oh, yeah. Okay, say no more.
Exactly, which probably not all that helpful. It can be helpful if you have a huge sample size. Maybe you do a correction for skin fold thickness to try to understand subcutaneous body fat. But yeah, exactly. Not going to be as helpful as our more robust options. And I'll actually start with the most robust because that leads us to the one that goes in the middle because they kind of go hand in hand. So the measurement we did with an ultrasound is you basically start near the shoulder when measuring the bicep, and you slowly drag it down towards like the crook of the elbow here, right? And you get this ability to look at the cross-sectional area of the entire length of the bicep. So our most robust measure was cross-sectional area of the entire bicep. And then the last measurement we did, which I would argue kind of goes in the middle there in terms of robustness, is we looked at some muscle thickness measurements along that scan.
Spot measurements,
right.
Selective measurements. Okay.
Right. So
at predetermined distances, I assume.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. It was 1/3 of the way down the bicep and 2/3 of the way down the bicep.
And the 2/3 of the way is generally the thing and that's to test the sub-analysis, I assume, of regional hypertrophy.
Bingo. Yeah. So the whole muscle cross-sectional area or whole muscle size leaned a little bit in favor of that lengthened condition, but not by a ton. And then some of the other measurements were a little bit mixed. Our hypothesis going into it is that the mixed condition would see better proximal muscle growth compared to the lengthening.
Because some other training data has, just to fill in the folks watching, some other training data has found that while on average overall growth seems to be better with lengthened bias training, it's especially better at the tail end of the muscle, closer to the joint, the distal end, we call it. And so the alternate hypothesis emerged from that, like, okay, so if lengthened is better for the tail end, maybe shortened is better for close to the bunched up part of the muscle, closer to the beginning of the limb. What did you find there?
The proximal site just didn't grow all that much, which kind of sucks. But the overall whole muscle growth was pretty solid. So it just kind of seemed like the growth was a little bit more distal.
And I think that's typically the case anyway.
Yeah.
And also it's what you want, because like distal growth gives you bubble muscles, whereas proximal growth makes you all bunched up and fucking not so great looking.
Yeah. Hashtag bubble muscles. That's right. What we're all after.
Dude, that's the thing. You got a whole lot of that going on yourself, by the way.
Hey, some lengthened training seems to do that. Some mixed training seems to do that. Mm-hmm. So overall, it just, from this study and kind of a concept we keep coming back to is one study is going to have a bunch of limitations, right? Like there's so many better ways to answer this question if we had different equipment. Like for example, what if our shortened biased cable curl, where it was basically propped up on a bench here, and quite hard in this shortened position, maybe that exercise just freaking sucks. Mm-hmm. And it's not really the fact that it was hard at a short muscle length. So I view it as a piece of the puzzle.
Yes.
And I still think on balance, there's kind of this slight directional leaning to lengthened bias training, meaning hey, make sure there's a decent amount of tension at longer muscle lengths. That could be done with a lengthened partial. That could be done with full range of motion and proper technique in the lengthened position, and just exercise selection. But I do think it's worth making the point that it's not a dichotomous decision, right?
Sure.
Like, for example, I'm aware of at least one study where volume was not equated. And one group added in this case, it was hip thrusts to a protocol. I think it was leg press and stiff leg deadlifts for glute growth. And
both
then they just
lengthened. Yeah.
both lengthened movements, add in some hip thrusts, which are short and biased. And in my experience, you can do hip thrusts till the cows come home. It's very easy to recover
Just
from.
die of boredom at some point.
Right. And that additional volume from the short and biased exercise did seem to lead to additional hypertrophy. So to me, this study is really just an avenue to make a broader point. At least the way that I think about it from a practical perspective is it's not either or, you know? Now, it might be a distribution of, okay, I'm going to bias most of my exercises towards, or a good amount of my exercises towards those that emphasize the lengthened position. But that doesn't mean I can't sprinkle in some short and biased movements, or that is a hard rule, because maybe it's the case that you can recover from more of those short and biased movements.
Almost certainly the case.
Right. That seems to be the case on average, especially for some muscles. And while I would be stronger in that claim if our mixed condition led to greater growth, I still think that is the case.
Yeah. You know the literature much better than I do, so I'll ask you this question. If you don't know, it's just no big deal. We'll cut it out to make it look like you're a fucking expert and you know everything. So we know pretty well that seemingly overall muscle growth benefits from lengthened bias. Yeah?
On average.
That's it. We also seemingly know that on average, the distal part of the muscle grows better from lengthened bias than alternative training.
Yeah, that's true. Recent meta-analysis indicated that. Yep.
I'm going to phrase this comedically, but I'm sure you understand my point. Other than coming along for the ride and doing some good stuff too, is there anything specific the shortened bias is good for in a way that overall and lengthened bias training doesn't cover?
In isolation, I can't say that there is something that a shortened bias movement does that a lengthened bias movement doesn't do. But to me, I don't think it's a question of in isolation. I think it's a question of what are the benefits and the costs, right?
So what are the benefits?
So the benefits is that shortened bias movements do still cause muscle growth, right?
Yes.
Which I think is worth people recognizing because, you know, you as a science communicator, you can make a claim that one thing is better than the other, but that doesn't mean the other thing isn't still productive.
Totally. And that's like one of those things where hopefully we don't make any thumbnails like this in the future, but like, you know, like someone doing a curl like this and the arrow is useless. Like it's not useless.
Right.
And if like people be like, yeah, man, because, you know, people misunderstand the shit all the time. So like, yeah, you fucking saying all this length to bias shit is true. How come all the fucking pros curl like this and they're huge? Like, no, we're not saying the other way doesn't work. Mm-hmm. We're saying if the pros did this more, they might be able to get bigger. Mm-hmm. So it definitely works to some extent. Mm-hmm. But I guess my question is like, imagine you have two football players on your team. Mm-hmm. One of them is not athletic, mm-hmm. 5'2", 130 pounds. And the other one looks like you. How tall are you?
6'3.5".
How much do you weigh?
225.
You ever play American football before?
No.
Don't worry about it. You're pretty athletic generally. You can move around, my
yeah.
man. So if we take someone who's also never played football, mm-hmm. but of the metrics I just described, 5'2", 130 or whatever, and we're like, okay, what does Bill do better on the football field than Josh? The answer is nothing. Mm-hmm. The answer is if you could clone Josh, you would just cut Bill off the team and just make two of you. Mm-hmm. So that's a very different than taking 6'6", 210-pound quarterback with a fucking badass arm mm-hmm. against a 6'7", 350-pound O-lineman that doesn't have a fucking arm but can fucking move. Mm-hmm. And it'd be like, which one's better at football? You're like, they're better at two different parts. Yeah. So it is our shortened partials, the Bill 5'2", 130-pound version, or are they like some kind of position in football, like a kicker? Who'd be like, that guy sucks. Yeah. Like, watch, he's got a golden leg.
I think that's a great analogy because to your point, you know, shortened emphasized movements don't seem to have a particular position on the football field
Yet. We found for
that we
them.
found.
Okay.
But they could have a position on the football field, and I'll try to run with your analogy. Let's say I think there's 11 players per side of football.
Scott, you were a football star in high school, right?
I think it's 11.
Sorry, I misunderstood. Scott just fucked a lot of cheerleaders. Similar, but
One and the same. So let's say you already have selected your 10 players, right? But it is impossible to add in a lengthened bias movement and still fit within the constraints of the 11 player constraints on the football field.
I got you. One more. You already got 10 players, but you ran out of fucking money in your team, and you can't afford stud number 11.
Right. So
He's too
money's your
expensive.
constraint, like fatigue can be your constraint.
100%.
Training.
Yes.
Yep.
So now, do you just play with 10 players? No, you're going to put someone on the team.
Yep. Exactly. To me, that is where it is really not a dichotomous decision. And I think for some muscles or some individuals, that consideration of being fatigue constrained, of doing some short and bias movements just to kind of be the cherry on top to not overreach, that's just not really a consideration because they're already constrained by time, right? But if you take someone that is not constrained by time, but they're constrained by fatigue, or maybe they are not totally convinced that the proximal region of a muscle grows equally from length and bias movements, which very well might be the case. Once we get more research, there might be some benefit. And I think when you look at the exercise variety research at large, there doesn't seem to be, it seems to be neutral to positive to have more exercise variety within reason.
Yeah. So like if you're not prioritizing your biceps for the next mesocycle and you've already run aground of all of your fucking super lengthened bias movements anyway, you might just do regular cable curls that are by definition short and biased. And someone's like, that's not optimal. You're like, well, it's a stand-in for me just not losing my bicep mass.
Yeah.
I only do like 6 sets of these a week and I don't lose my biceps. They're like, okay, well, when you want to grow, what do you do? Well, then I fucking lay down on the bench, you do lying curls, you do all that other fucking bullshit that does the thing. It's kind of like putting Bill on the practice squad. Like you can still get hit. And so the guys are going to hit you, but if you're still alive, you're definitely a big, important part of the team.
Yeah. And maybe an even easier analogy for folks is training to failure. In isolation, I would feel pretty confident saying that one set of training to failure is going to be better or produce more hypertrophy than one set at 3 reps in reserve.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean you only train to failure.
Right.
Because there are costs with that.
Yes.
Same idea with exercise selection. And where exercise selection gets kind of has an additional potential benefit is just it's still an area of research. I don't want to say it's in its infancy, but man, we always learn new stuff all the time. And I'm always aware that like I have blind spots. I don't know what I don't know. And it's just worth keeping your perspective open to the possibility that hey, maybe if we had a bunch of those studies like the one that we did of lengthened biased only versus mixed lengthened and shortened biased, then maybe once we get 5 or 6 studies, there's a slight benefit to mixed training. We don't know. And that possibility is why I would not recommend exclusively lengthened biased training. But I think there's plenty of evidence to kind of bias your distribution of exercise selection in that direction.
Sure. That makes perfect sense. Josh, this has been awesome. People at this point are addicted to the sound of your voice and the look and the whole thing, really. And they desperately are clawing at their computer screens to try to figure out where they can find more of you. Do we have any kind of breadcrumbs to throw them, or are you just gone into the mysterious wind?
Physically or digitally or what?
Well, listen, we'll do digitally here, and if you need to set up some physical shit, that's for you and your DMs, sir.
Yeah. Well, you can find my DMs on Instagram if you just look up my name or my handle, which is josh.datadrivenstrength.
Super. We'll throw that in the description.
Awesome. And even beyond there, because Instagram doesn't get a whole lot of love. Where we've been putting more love lately is in our podcast, which is primarily on YouTube. So if you're already on YouTube, just look up Data Driven Strength. That's where we're putting our best stuff. I love it.
Right. Do you guys have guests, or is it just the 3 of you guys chatting about science?
We have guests when we think it's necessary.
Dope.
Which is not all that often. But like, for example, we recently published some volume research that we discussed earlier. And we brought on a few different perspectives, quote unquote, more pro volume people versus quote unquote, more anti-volume or lower volume people. And it's been a really cool avenue, and we're enjoying that. And we think this medium is quite appropriate for scientific communication. So that's why we're leaning into it quite a bit.
I love it. YouTube land, that's great. We'll throw all that in the description. Dude, huge thanks to you. You're halfway through a PhD at this point, or some?
I'd say like 75%, 70%, something like that.
Godspeed.
Hey, I'm hopeful that's the case, and thank you for having me on, and also thank you for your generosity and contributions to our lab, because I mentioned the volume cycling study where I'm currently running for my dissertation. My recruitment has been a hell of a lot easier because we've been able to offer financial compensation because of RP's grants to our lab, which has been awesome. So we appreciate that. Goes a very, very long way for us, and is helping the field quite a bit. So thank you, and thanks for having me on.
Huge honor to support you guys and a bunch of science. And it's tough because I don't have a magenta Lamborghini because you assholes need money for science all the goddamn time.
Worth it.
It's worth it. That's what I tell myself. It would look nice though, wouldn't it?
It would look nice, but hey, we're helping science is stronger. So
because if you're not jacked in your fucking Lamborghini, who gives a
cares?
shit? And that's it, folks. See you next time.